Hello and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. It is August 20th of 2020, and we come today with a special conversation about a subject that was really in the headlines about 2 years ago in 2018 when former LDS Bishop Sam Young held a march and a series of protests advocating for positive change in the Mormon Church around the issue of child safety, particularly in regards to how the church conducted and conceptualized worthiness interviews. Well, recently at the 2020 FAIRMormon conference, a recent convert of the church and former ordained pastor made the argument that, in fact, we should see some positive aspects of those interviews and preserve them. And it caused a bit of a stir. She was later quoted and interviewed for a Salt Lake Tribune article, and the buzz on social media really showed that this issue is one which continues to be very relevant and continues to draw passionate responses on different sides of the issue. And in wanting to cover this once again, I thought it would be great to get some people who can bring perspectives that aren't really centered on whether you're ex-Mormon or Mormon or anything like that, but more centered on the concept of both mental health and developmental well-being for children, as well as pastoral care, what that means in a broad context of religion in general, and how you can distinguish healthy from unhealthy dynamics and how pastoral care is actually implemented. And so in order to do that, I've invited a couple of guests that I think will bring great perspective to our conversation. So we'll start out with Dr. Julie de Azevedo Hanks. It's easier for me to say Julie Hanks, but let me see if I can bring our guests onto the screen. Okay, so by way of introduction, Julie de Azevedo Hanks is a licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist with 28 years of experience specializing in women's emotional health and relationships. She's an assistant professor of social work at Utah Valley University. Dr. Hanks is the founder and director of Wasatch Family Therapy, which is an outpatient therapy clinic in Cottonwood Heights in Bountiful, Utah. She's the author of The Burnout Cure and The Assertiveness Guide for Women. She's a blogger, a local and national media contributor, online influencer, and private practice consultant, and an award-winning songwriter to boot. So she's a native Californian, but currently lives in Sandy, Utah. Did I cover it all, Dr. Hanks?
You got it.
Okay.
John.
Excellent. And joining Dr. Hanks is Katie Langston, who, if you're familiar with the Protect LDS Children movement, you will recognize her as one of the keynote speakers for the initial march in 2018. Katie Langston she would describe herself as a doubter by nature and a believer by grace. She grew up in a Mormon close-knit college town in northern Utah and considers herself a recovering perfectionist. Katie is now a candidate for ordination in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and the Associate Director of Internal Communications at Luther Seminary. Her approach to theology is realistic but faithful, orthodox but seeking. She's a digital communications strategist, writer, evangelist, and preacher. And as I said, in March of 2018, she was a featured speaker at the Protect LDS Children March. Did I get it all, Katie? Anything else to add to that?
Sounds about right to me.
Okay. Both of you are phenomenal voices on this issue, and you were brought to my attention really in the discussions that arose on social media around this one presentation and the Salt Lake Tribune article. So I thought it would be good for us to frame this discussion around really going through the FAIRMormon presentation, which I have access to, and I thought we would start at the beginning and go through it and kind of pause as we go. Are there any introductory comments that either of you would like to add just as we start this conversation?
Let's get it started.
All right, let's get into it. So let me share my screen here, and let's get something where we have something a little bit more maximized. And we're going to start out. This is the president or one of the officials of FAIRMormon who is introducing our speaker, and that's how we will become familiar with her background as well.
Our next speaker is Jennifer Roach. She earned a Master of Divinity from the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology and a Master of Counseling from Argosy University. Before her conversion to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, she was an ordained minister in the Anglican Church. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Jennifer Roach.
All right, well, they cleaned the podium here. I think it's really interesting. She comes with a very particular background, which gives her sort of a voice of authority on this issue, which she'll inform us about because she herself is a survivor of abuse.
Thank you, Scott, for that kind introduction. My name is Jennifer Roach. I am a mental health therapist from Seattle, Washington. I'm a new member of this church. I was baptized about 18 months ago. Prior to that, I was ordained as an Anglican minister. I gave up my ordination the day before my baptism. I have two loves. One is theology and one is psychology. And I love seeing how those two interact, how theological beliefs form practices and how those practices impact the mental health of individuals.
Okay, I just want to pause right there, and this will kind of be how we go through the presentation, is when she says something worthy of comment, then just let me know and I'll pause it. I think the point she makes here is actually very important for how we conceptualize and understand this paradigm of interviews. She says that theology has implications for mental health. And I would agree completely, and I think that's something really to keep centered in how we see this. I don't know if either of you have anything to add to that, but I certainly want to keep that in mind as we go through this.
Yeah, John, I agree with that. And at the heart, my critique of her, as we'll get into her presentation, is really a theological one. That the problem, the core problem from a theological perspective, is the theological framework in which worthiness interviews are conducted, and so therefore they cannot reach the ends that she's hoping for because the theological framework is not compatible with the kind of outcomes she's describing. So we'll get into that, but just to affirm, theology is really at the center of pastoral caregiving.
Oh, excellent. All right.
So today, I'm coming to you to talk about the subject of youth bishop interviews and some of the nervousness that surrounds those when it comes to the possibility of sexual abuse. Now, before I really started working on this topic, on this talk, I spent 2 weeks reading as many of the stories as I could find of people who have been through bishop interviews and it hasn't gone well for them. So I don't come to this unaware of the pain that is in this subject for some people. And I just want you to know that up front. I have that in my heart as we go. So we will split our time up in this way. First, I have some words of introduction about sexual abuse in a faith context and what its impact is. I have some new original research to present, as well as 4 reasons why I believe youth bishop interviews are a positive factor. They're a protective factor for kids, or at least some kids. I have some recommendations, and then I'd be delighted to take your questions. So we start by talking about clergy sexual misconduct and clergy sexual abuse.
Okay, so a big part of the introduction to her thing is a story that is a representation that she's giving us of what she describes as clergy sexual abuse. And she spends about 10 minutes or so talking about a Pentecostal female minister in California who ends up having an affair with one of the other people in their office and then disappears. And then when people are up in alarm, comes back and lies about where they were, fakes having been abducted, and tries to hide the reality of their affair. And this is used as an example of ecclesiastical sexual abuse. Now, what do you guys think about using that particular example in the context of talking about youth protection?
I thought it was very confusing because it seems almost irrelevant to the rest of her talk. So an example of 2 consenting adults engaging in sexual behavior, even if one is a clergy, is entirely different than a clergy and a child. And so I didn't follow where she was,
point she was making with this at all.
Yeah, I felt like certainly it's an example that abuse does happen. But as you mentioned, the power dynamics between a youth and a pastor or somebody who claims to represent God it enters a whole different level. And for me, it was particularly ironic that her talk in the FAIRMormon conference immediately followed a talk detailing Helen Mar Kimball and what it was that convinced her to enter into an unconventional relationship with Joseph Smith. Because if she had used a religious leader who made promises of familial salvation to a 14-year-old child in order to coerce her to submit to an unorthodox marital relationship, well, that would have been a very relevant example of ecclesiastical abuse that has sexual elements. But I don't know. Clearly, it's a FAIRMormon audience, and that's not the paradigm that they are adopting for this. Now, I'm a former member of the church. I no longer attend, and so I don't usually advocate for faithful perspectives in that regard, but I try to be even-handed. And I know, Katie, I believe you're now in a different religious paradigm yourself, so you're a former member. Dr. Hanks, are you still attending? Are you...
Yeah, I am.
Okay. All right. Cool. So I think the benefit of having these different perspectives is that this isn't something that says that the church is all bad, all churches are bad. It's something that's really trying to be objective about looking at, does ecclesiastical abuse exist? And if it does, how can we safeguard vulnerable populations against it? And that's kind of the perspective I want to take. Yeah. All right, so let's keep going. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to skip over the example because as interesting, and it really is a fascinating story, so certainly go out and check it out. But
sounds like it could have come straight out of Nauvoo, man. I mean, that Amy Semple McPherson sounds like she was a bit of a hot mess.
Yeah.
Sir.
Okay, so let's now go to now she's going to kind of summarize that and then move on to the pillars of her talk, which is really making the argument that interviews are not only a positive, but they are protective, which is an interesting thing.
Still are in existence today. So why do I tell you this story? Well, if the ending was a surprise to you, it's probably only because of the time period or because of Amy's gender. We don't tend to think of women being the ones committing clergy sexual misconduct. But the story illustrates a point, and the point is, abuse happens, misconduct happens in every church, no matter how unexpected it is. And today's stories go quite a bit further than the story of Amy. Stories that we have been hearing about in the news that involve leaders, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And these stories prompt a wide variety of responses.
Hey, John,
it's a very delicate...
Yeah.
So one thing she says that really strikes me is she's framing this and these stories as if they're unexpected. But I actually think her own personal story and the story she shares about, a surprising, woman perpetrator of clergy abuse actually demonstrates that they should be expected. We should expect and therefore build into our systems protections. Because it's not unexpected. It's unfortunately, as she points out, completely expected and prevalent in every community, religious or otherwise.
Yeah. I think she starts out this conversation saying that she's familiar with the issues. She spent 2 weeks reading the stories of victims. And it may be that she spent time on Sam Young's website where survivors of abuse of many different types have related their stories in a very vulnerable way. I think that's half of the story, though, because there is a body of research from people examining this issue from both religious and non-religious institutional perspectives that have also looked at those stories, because what we learn from those stories are the areas of vulnerability where people have taken advantage of disparities of power and of places where they're able to cross boundaries of propriety and produce what ultimately ends up in abuse. And so I would hope that the examination of this also looked at things like the Australian Commission on Institutional Child Abuse and other research, because that body of research has produced best practices. And when you look at the advocacy that Sam Young and the other people who have been activists on this issue, it's not, hey, we need to totally get rid of anything that any bishop can ask any youth. It's, if we're going to do this, let's take a look at best practices and see how we can reshape and reconceptualize the Mormon cultural paradigm around the theology to account for those best practices. Right.
John, what's interesting is that the church has taken those precautions with other leaders in primary and with youth groups. They have to be too deep for any activity. Youth can't spend time alone with an adult. So in that area, they're more protected than the bishop's interviews, which is interesting.
Yeah. And I think there's even a concrete expression of that where, there was this period of time in the last decade where all over the nation, suddenly windows started showing up in the doors of the primary rooms, so that there was never this, adult concealed with children in a way that was not open to observation. But that did not happen in the bishop's office. When this issue was at the forefront, I spoke to our local Lutheran pastor and asked him, what steps and what measures that they took. And he mentioned that there was a great deal of facilities cost involved with reshaping the physical space of their pastoral center so that any space where a youth and a leader would be together was visible to other responsible parties, and that there was no private exclusive area for that. And so when you look at that body of recommendations that I've talked about, a lot of the times a core part of that is rearranging the physical facilities so that something as simple as not allowing a private, unobserved, and therefore vulnerable interaction to take place, if that makes sense. All right, let's keep going.
And troubling issue. And because those local leaders have sometimes been bishops, it has given some cause to be skeptical about what happens in bishop interviews, and should a bishop be spending time alone with young people especially. People who are concerned about the potential for abuse in these interviews are right to be asking the questions. They're logical questions. And the consequences of clergy sexual abuse are serious. This is the movie Spotlight, which if you have not seen and you care about the issue of clergy sexual abuse, it is required viewing. True story about sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. It is not rated PG, and for very good reasons. It deals with very disturbing content. At one point in the movie, one of the characters who has been abused by a priest tries to articulate what it is like to be on the receiving end of abuse from somebody that represents God to you. So I'm going to read you the quote, though I have cleaned up the language a little bit for this audience. He says, "When a priest pays attention to you, it's a big deal. He asks you to collect the hymnals or take out the trash, and you feel special. It's like God is asking you for help. So maybe it's a little weird when he tells you a dirty joke, but now you've got a secret together, so you go along. And then he shows you a dirty picture, and you go along. And you go along, and you go along, and you go along until one day he asks you for a sexual favor. And you go along with that too, because you feel trapped, because he's groomed you. And how do you say no to God, right? See, it's important to understand this is not just physical abuse, it's spiritual abuse too. Yes. And when a priest does this to you, he...
Exactly. It's not spiritual abuse, which is the misuse of power, especially by someone who's been given or who you have accepted as having spiritual authority over you. And so it doesn't have to reach the level of physical sexual abuse to be abusive. In my circumstance, which I've been pretty open about, no one ever molested me or touched me or the bishops or anything like that. I actually don't even think the bishops intended harm, but the impact of the interviews were profoundly damaging and painful and traumatizing, to the point that, that I feel very comfortable referring to that as spiritual abuse. And I think that's that's a really important thing to keep in mind, that not all scars are physical, not all wounds are hands-on, as it were.
Yeah. I think she's describing, or the quote here in particular is really bringing to mind the process of grooming. Mm-hmm. And this is a really challenging issue when you look at the subject of child sexual abuse in religious contexts, because grooming, if you take two examples of two leaders, one of whom is getting close to a vulnerable child and their family so that he can normalize interactions in a way that will ultimately give him access to the child for abuse, and then you look at a different leader who sees a vulnerable child and family and reaches out to help them, you're not going to see any difference between those two examples until the abuse happens. And it's one of those things where you can't really distinguish what grooming is until abuse actually happens. And when you acknowledge this, when you know this, and you take those two things that we've already covered, which is that abuse is real, there are predators out there, and that there are things that you can do to minimize the risk of abuse, then that's where these protective measures come into play. And if you're intentionally allowing and celebrating one of the most dangerous and fraught sorts of interactions, then there should be red flags that go off. And I think that's why this issue is so inflammatory in people who think about it.
Yep.
All right, let's keep going.
He robs you of your faith. So you reach for the bottle or the needle, and when those don't work, you jump off a bridge. That's why we call ourselves survivors. And certainly is not just the Catholic Church, it's our church too, right? And full disclosure, it happened to me as well. You could read all about it if you wanted. It was on the front page of my hometown newspaper, the Modesto Bee, along with many other news outlets. I grew up outside of the Latter-day Saint Church, and in the church where I grew up, one pastor after another sexually abused teenagers. So not only do I know the prevalence of abuse and the damage that it does as a mental health therapist, I know it in my own life, in my own body, in the lives of 20 of my peers. So knowing that my purpose here today is to talk to you about youth bishop interviews, you might assume that I'm going to tell you that they're terrible, that they're wrong, that they're bad, and that they all should stop. Not quite. So I know people who hold this belief, and I know and love and respect them, and I understand why they hold it. I don't share it, and I'm going to explain to you why. First, we're going to look at some new original research that has been done.
Okay, so Dr. Hanks, in particular, this next section that she's going to bring up, she's just framed as new original research. And this is, I think, when I was watching this originally, this is where I really had a hard time dealing with this talk. And it was because, is this research? What do you think?
Well, it's non-scientific. It's a survey, and it's self-selected individuals. So I don't think you can make general statements based on this survey. It also doesn't include people who have left the church because of abuse. These are people who are still in the church. So I think that skews the numbers as well.
Okay. And she acknowledges some of these limitations, but I think the area where we tread carefully here is using research like this and then using them as a basis to justify policy, particularly in the face of much more robust bodies of research that have already informed good best practices. That is certainly an ongoing self-evaluation paradigm, but already exists, that would absolutely say we need to reformulate these policies around interviews. So with that said, let's see how she presents the data.
687 adults surveyed for the Uplift Bishop Youth Interview Study. If you're unfamiliar with Uplift, they are an online discussion group, probably a similar audience to what the FAIRMormon audience is. They're people who are trying to remain faithful, but they got some questions. There'd be some significant overlap. There'd also be some significant differences in those two audiences, but they're not that much different than perhaps to you who are listening today. Uplift collected this data over a 10-month period in 2018 and 2019. I was not involved in the data collection, but they have been kind enough to let me use this for my presentation. So 687 adults, not every adult is asked every question, and not every question that's asked gets responded to. So we don't always have 687 responses. I wish that we did. So who is in this data set? Well, if we start with age, 50% of them are between age 35 and 55. 75% of them are age 35 and older, which means most people in this data are at least 17 years removed from their own experience of being interviewed by a bishop. But presumably, that 50% that's making up ages 35 to 50, presumably those are the people who are raising teenagers and are having to rethink through these issues anyway. When I received this data, my first guess, the first statistical test that I ran was, how does age impact how they're seeing this issue? I thought for sure the older people were going to tend a little bit more conservative and not want to see change, and the younger people were going to tend a little bit more willing or eager to see change. Age is not a factor at all in this survey. Could not have surprised me more. Gender was not asked in this survey. I wish that it had been. It might prove to be helpful, although...
Dr. Julie, I saw that facial expression. How can you make a survey like this?
I just can't imagine not asking gender. That's such an important data collection method. I mean, you don't know who these people really are. And if they're all male or all female, that makes a difference, especially with bishops' interviews and this topic. So I think there's a lot of information that's missing here.
Yeah, I think particularly, I've interacted with the Uplift group before, and as she said, it's very similar to the FAIRMormon group, where there are people who are aware of some of the issues, but there's a strong motivation to find a place of faithfulness, even if it means reformulating what it means to be faithful, what it means to be true. But there is a bias in that really colors how you approach issues, particularly if they are potentially embarrassing to this church, which means so much to you, your life, in some cases your profession. You know, there's many different reasons that people want to be protective of the institution. But I think that, on top of just self-selecting surveys in and of themselves, have an existing bias. And I think this bias overlaying on that is another reason to be very careful about drawing conclusions from this data. But particularly without the benefit of gender, particularly when the interviews themselves are so gendered. You know, it's always a male authority. And so, you know, you would want to know how young women interact with that male authority, how it differs from men. That was just a very important data point. So the Uplift survey, again, it was not designed by statisticians. It was not designed by people with a background in this issue. It was designed by faithful Mormons looking for an understanding of the issue just from a layperson's perspective. And I've put a request to Uplift to get the data itself. They're not making it available currently. I've been told that there may be intention to publish it in the future, but it was made available to this presenter. So,
Go ahead, Katie.
I was going to say, who's going to publish it? But anyway, go on.
Be nice.
Well, again, leaving out progressive Mormons and post-Mormons, it almost makes the data useless.
Yeah. So it's almost like having any discussion now framed around this data runs a risk of intentionally or by design pulling you in directions that are you shouldn't be going anywhere in that direction because you're not guided by anything anywhere near authentic data.
Yeah.
All right, let's keep going.
So I thought age was going to be helpful, and it was not. So how do these people describe themselves and their relationship to faith? Well, 70% of them call themselves active believing members. They were not given a definition of what that meant, and the assumption was the categories were self-explanatory. About 9.5% are less active believing, 8.5% are active non-believing, about 7% are less active non-believing, and 5% were former members. That's sort of how that breaks down. So we start by looking at people's experience with bishop interviews. And just a note, in our church, change does not happen because of survey data. And this is not intended to be...
Okay.
Wasn't there, I think there was actually a general conference talk that addressed that and said, like, good inspiration is based on good information.
Yes.
And so I thought about that when she made that comment. I'm like, really? Because I actually recently got a survey from the church.
Yes.
And so if they're not using that to change policy or to change, why are they sending surveys?
Yeah. And I think the most famous example of which is before the 1990 change to the temple ceremony, which eliminated the actions of the penalties, a survey was famously sent out to church members nationwide, if not worldwide, asking them details about how they felt about the temple, the ceremony, the endowment. And it's believed that that feedback informed them about the nature of both eliminating the penalties as well as eliminating the preacher who used to be part of it, that many members said it made them feel disconnected or unreasonably harsh towards their prior prior congregations. And was unnecessarily divisive. And so that's the first most famous example. But as you said, the church is now sending out that, and I think we can forgive her for being a new member and learning maybe what it means to be a prophet and the Q15, because as you say, it is part of their theology. And I think you could even go back to the Doctrine and Covenants when he says, really ponder and study out these issues in your mind. The church, with its resources, is going to say, well, if we are going to study out an issue, that means practically we can gather data, and that's how we do it in the modern age. All right, let's keep going.
A petition for change. This is a snapshot. What are people feeling and thinking about this issue? So the question is, should interviews continue as they have done, including asking questions of chastity? 56% of our respondents say yes. This number is made up of just over half of the participants describe themselves believing in some way. They're either believing active or believing less active. The remaining 44%, they don't really possess any belief, and they still believe that interviews should continue and continue asking about chastity. Here are some comments from some of the respondents. As a convert at age 16, my bishop interviews were absolutely invaluable to help me repent of sexual habits. Another says, as a youth, I made decisions based on knowing I would be held accountable. A third, when I was young, I was so afraid to share my problems. In a way, I wanted the bishop to ask me more specific questions. I felt so confused about what I was doing and if it was moral or not, but I didn't know how to talk about it, and apparently nobody else did either, because they never brought it up. So in this category, this 54% of people who say, yeah, these interviewers are good and they should continue, you do see a lot of conflict, a lot of comments from people saying it was really hard or it was really embarrassing, but I can see the good in it now. And this may be the most interesting chart of all when you compare it to our next one. These are people who say the interviews should either not continue or not contain questions about chastity, made up of 90% active believing members and only 10% combined from every other category. Let me say it a different way. People who do not have a testimony of the restored gospel are more likely in this data set to be in the 56% that say interviews should continue than our active believing members.
All right. I agree with her. That is a phenomenal bit of data. I think when I think about how I used to conceptualize the church and the prophet and authority and morality, it was really hard for me to go against anything that the brethren enacted by way of policy. And certainly worthiness interviews, to me, that felt like this was a paradigm that echoed my relationship with God. You know, the worthiness interaction that I'd have with the bishop was something that I would expect to have with Christ. And so it's almost like you couldn't even, I was really shocked when they changed the temple ceremony the way that they did, because it seems so central and core to the religion. And so I would, it's hard to believe that even active members, and if you look at how this line is drawn, the different categories that she had before, active believing was one category, but there was also less active believing who still had a testimony. And so she maybe left them out of this thing about, people who don't have a testimony are more likely to say they should continue. How did this data strike each of you?
Go ahead, Katie.
Oh, I'll go. So there were a couple of things that really struck me about it. First, it is curious to me, and I would love to be able to ask those folks who are more removed from the church. And I'm just curious about this sample, and maybe there's like 2 who answered the question, and that's why it's skewed this way, since we don't actually know. We don't have the data in front of us, so who knows what sort of weird things are going on with the data. But it is really peculiar and interesting to me to hear that that many people who are sort of disconnected from the church appreciated those interviews. And I'd be really curious to just talk to them more and to learn more about what their experience was like. But the other thing that strikes me is, like, if we're talking about a sample size here, a sample of 75% active believing members of the church, and like nearly half of them are saying, yeah, this isn't great. Like, that's noteworthy.
It is. Even with the problems with the survey structure and everything that we've talked about, that would tend to bias you in a totally opposite direction from this slide. Yeah. And so I think that even makes this slide even more powerful. And I think particularly if it's an anonymous survey, then like many things, when people feel free to express their conscience without fear of social consequence of speaking ill of the Lord's anointed, maybe we're seeing a more realistic reflection of how members feel about this.
Right.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. Katie did a great job. I think let's keep going.
All right. Let's see here. We'll bring us back to this.
That should give us some serious pause. There's a lot to consider here. So we're looking at 90% of 44% of 687. What are we actually talking about? It's 271 people. Not everyone answered every question, but if you extrapolated it out, that's what you would get. It's 39% of the total population that was surveyed. How that relates to the general population of the church, I have no way of answering that question. I think it's a good question. I don't have any way to get at that data. Remember, this is the Uplift survey. This is surveying people who self-identify as folks who have questions. I think they're an ideal group to talk about this issue with, because you're probably going to get the leading edge of critical thinking on it. So my interpretation of the 44%, these are good people. They want their church to be stronger and better. They're not distractors. They're not trying to tear the church down, but they're worried. And they don't know what to think necessarily about these bishop interviews. They don't unintentionally want to put their kids in danger. They love their children and they love their church. I read them as good-hearted people.
I want to pause here and just comment on, I see this particular moment as a very positive moment in this presentation. And that is because she has validated that this is a real problem and that people have real concerns. And it's okay to even be critical of the current implementation of this policy and still see people who are critical of it as people who are faithful, who love the church, who want to see things turn out for the best for not only vulnerable youth populations, but also for the church itself. And I think latching on to that and having that be a part of this presentation is one of, I think, the very positive elements of it. I don't know if that struck either of you as well.
Yeah.
She's going to transition from that interview data, which kind of just sets the framework for, okay, there's an issue here. There are mixed perspectives on how we should move forward. So she's kind of just setting it up for what are her 4 reasons, 4 pillars for why interviews as they exist now are actually positive and protective. And she'll transition into that shortly.
My concern is that they might not be seeing some unintended consequences that would come if teens were no longer allowed access to these interviews. So I'm going to pause reporting to you on research and give you my 4 reasons why I think bishop interviews should actually continue. Number 1, it's appropriate for a teenager's developmental level to be talking about this stuff. They are dealing with these issues already. We are not introducing these issues to them. They already are dealing with them. Most people would agree with that statement. So the question becomes, does the conversation have to be with someone, one, outside of their own family? And then if that answer is yes, does it have to be with a bishop? And those are kind of the main sticking points here. And there's some research that helps us out, not from the...
Okay, before we get to that research, I'm interested in both of you what your perspective is on those questions. Do youth need to have a non-parental adult, trusted adult that they can talk about sexual issues to, and should it be a bishop? From the pastoral care, Katie, what do you think?
I mean, the word need is sort of a heavy word. Can youth benefit from non-parental adult mentors? Of course. And depending on the situation at home, whether their own family is abusive or they don't feel comfortable having certain conversations with their parents, to have someone that they can talk to about, questions regarding their budding sexuality. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, that's appropriate. And if it is a pastoral caregiver or someone who shares their religious faith and values, awesome. So far, no complaints.
Okay. There's kind of a straw man argument behind some of this, which is the idea that the people who are critical of these policies want there to be zero zilch conversation about sexuality from religious leaders because that's abusive. And that seems to lay under the surface of a lot of how she's formulating the critics of this position. So you just said that there is a role for religious leaders, non-parental religious leaders, to talk about sexual issues. And so I think that how that happens then becomes important.
Yeah, I think. Oh, go ahead, Julie.
I was just going to say, usually the child chooses who that mentor is. In the case of a bishop, they're assigned a bishop that they may not feel comfortable talking with, they may not feel close to, they may be, a female may not feel comfortable talking to an older male. So I think that youth can benefit from, like Katie was saying, benefit from talking about sexual issues with another adult, but of their choosing.
How do you see that potentially happening in the framework of the church? How do we give youth the choice for, choosing their adult?
So I think it's important to have, to have teaching around sexual ethics. And if it comes from and that is an appropriate thing to talk about in a group context. There's really good sex ed curriculum that's been put out by the Unitarian Universalists and the United Church of Christ called Our Whole Lives. So for there to be sort of sex education on a group level, especially from someone who's trained in it and has some credibility in terms of leading these conversations about values and consent and, what do we think about sex before marriage, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, there's a place for the faith community to come alongside folks. Sexuality is a really important core issue of our humanity, right? So absolutely the church should speak into that, but that's a far cry from a construct that says, if you commit a sexual sin, you've just done the sin next to murder, and the Spirit of God cannot dwell in your unclean temple of your body, right? So we should have sex positive, body positive, frank and helpful sex education that and group, kind of instruction that helps kind of talk about values and consent and fidelity and trust and love and pleasure and all of those things within the context of this is something beautiful that God has given us, that's not shame-based and worthiness-based. So yes, broadly speaking, should the church speak into this? Absolutely, but how you speak into it and what you say about it really, really, really matters.
Yeah. Dr. Hanks, you mentioned giving youth choice in who they see, and that the arbitrary selection of a bishop now really eliminates that for many people. How would you postulate that we could extend choice to youth in that regard, just in terms of who they get to speak with?
Well, I think they're probably already doing it. I mean, I hope my kids would go to their aunts and uncles, family members, probably their aunts is who my children would go to. Not a man at church. They just wouldn't. So I don't, and especially my daughter, my daughters, I don't want, and one of my daughters had a really bad experience with a bishop. And so this is personal. And my husband is a bishop currently. So that's just a fun fact. Okay. So we talk about this a lot.
We all know the reality is that the youth are going to TikTok for all of this. So,
and each other.
Yeah, exactly.
It's Snapchat.
No, I don't know. See, that should bishops be able to communicate with youth by Snapchat? To me, that's like a big red flag, but that's a different subject. Okay. So let's keep going because we want to stay on track with her conversation here.
From the Uplift data, from social psychologist James L. Furrow. He's one of the founders of emotionally focused therapy, and he did some research on decision-making between religious and non-religious teenagers, and how do teenagers learn to make good decisions? And so he asks, does it make a difference if youth can speak with a non-parental figure about sensitive issues such as sexuality? His research says a resounding yes. For the best outcomes, youth actually need 3 non-parental adults who can help them contextualize their religious worldview into their lives. This in no way downplays the role of mom and dad and the importance of the family. It just recognizes that during adolescence, students are starting to sort of look around the world, and they need to know that it's not just their family who's seeking to live out these principles, but other adults who know and care about them are doing it too. It's no longer enough just to live out the faith of mom and dad.
Now, I did some background checking into this. She mentions Furrow as the researcher, and when you do literature search for publications by this individual, there are a number of them. I was able to contact Jennifer and ask which paper in particular she was referencing, and it was a 2000 paper that was not openly available online, but there was a 2009 and a 2004 paper that she said build on the ideas of his original paper. And when you read those, the framework that he is examining this entire question in is something called social capital theory. And the idea is that the more interactions that an adolescent has with trusted non-parental figures who share common goals, common cultural norms, common religious beliefs, and a moral paradigm, the more of those interactions and the higher the quality of those interactions, which she seems to mean the higher level of authority that an adolescent is able to access, well, then that gives them more social resources to draw upon when struggling through the challenges of maturing from youth to adulthood. And so looking at this question and trying to use that as an objective measure of the resources that someone has, then you can draw the conclusion that they're going to be able to navigate and make choices better because they have more interaction. So if you look at it that way, then a Mormon youth who has every 6 months an interview with the bishop, occasional temple interviews, anytime they have questions, they know they can go to the bishop. It's the highest local level of authority, and they feel like that bishop knows them. Well, you can say, well, that is then somebody with the high social capital, many resources, and so they're going to do better. And the thing that I see is missing from that level of analysis is the nature of the context. She said at the beginning that the theology matters and it has real implications for the health of the culture. And so by that paradigm, we could look at Scientologists and say that if you just go to a whole bunch of their auditing sessions, which you can talk to former Scientologists about, and they're very abusive and very harmful, then you're going to be better. It's missing an element of that analysis. You're shaking your head, Katie. What do you think?
Agree.
Okay,
And
I think
this research wasn't about talking about sexuality specifically, correct?
yeah,
John?
yeah,
It was just in general. So I think sexuality is kind of its own thing. Having resources to function as an adult is, sexuality is part of that. But I don't know that you can draw this just conclusions about sexuality from general support.
yeah. And as Katie has mentioned before, as I lived myself, when you have misinformed or poorly informed leaders who believe that they have the mantle of authority and interpret that to mean that any bias that pops into their head is the Spirit talking to them, then they may feel empowered to cross boundaries or to convey things as truth that are not truth in ways that they don't understand can be harmful or damaging to a youth. When you look at the issue of masturbation in how it's been treated in Mormonism, it's changed over the decades, and there's some people that have published on this, but in the era that I grew up in, there were so many very, very damning things taught about that issue. And when you apply that to a population of youth that is who they're turning to, these religious leaders, for understanding themselves, the changes they're going through in adolescence, then it sets up this, talk about perpetual inadequacy and that you're a failure. And you can find stories even of people feeling that so deeply that it feeds into the cycle of depression that leads to suicide.
Yep.
It can be very harmful. All right. And let's keep going for this. Here we go.
So we see from Furrow at least 3 non-parental adults, but does it have to be a bishop? It's a fantastic question. And to be fair, Furrow is not looking at the Latter-day Saint context. He's looking at a broad, mainstream Christian context. But his research would say, yes, best outcome, it has to be someone who's in the bishopric. And here's why. He says, young people have to know that their issues are important to the highest level of leadership. He points out that teenagers have an intuitive sense about the issues that are important to their leaders and the issues that are not, and it matters to them that their top leaders care about their own specific concerns. So why should it matter to a
So that, I think we can hear in the way she explains that, reflected this idea that the higher level of respected non-parental adult you access, it's a higher quality of social contact, and that feeds into the calculus of your social capital resources. But there's a hidden imbalance in that, and she addresses it later. But then the question is, some people have said, well, if we can allow young women to have this interview with the Relief Society president or with the Young Women's president, so that there's not that inherent imbalance that goes along with a man interviewing a young female about matters of sexuality in private behind closed doors. And I think that we could say, well, at least that's something, one step in the right direction. I'm a physician. There were times when I was involved in care of women where if I was ever in a room, I had to have a chaperone because I was male and the patients were female. But if a female doctor was in the room with a patient, that chaperone was not necessarily needed. So you can see there's that imbalance that other non-religious contexts acknowledge. But Mormons don't even have that accessible because the highest leader is the best quality relationship. And since women are not allowed in that position, they're not even given the respect of being that type of resource, if that makes sense.
John, one thing, the bishops are also in a position of being a judge, which is different than just being a high status individual in the community. That just adds a different dynamic. They could take away certain privileges. They can, so it's not just open sharing. There's a judgment layer there that isn't addressed in what she's speaking about.
Right, and certainly if you're talking about this in the broad Christian context, you know, one of my big awakening moments in learning about the wider Christian world was the real difference between a paradigm focused on personal worthiness and standards and one based on grace and acknowledgement of the imperfection of everyone. And Katie, I think you've mentioned this as a key part of the difference between examining these types of interviews and something like a confessional.
Right.
Yeah. All right, so let's take a look at where she goes from here.
To a full-grown man called into the bishopric that some kid in his ward is struggling with sexualized thoughts or actions.
Which, time out.
Well, according to Furrow's research, it matters quite a lot.
It's rare. It's barely ever going to happen, but...
What? I mean, give me, like, what are they? If they're like 15, they're not struggling with it. It's normal. It's natural. They're only struggling with it because they're shamed about it.
Yeah.
That's some crazy talk right there.
So when you were talking before about a different paradigm for teaching sexual things, since, you know, it's part of humanity, it's unavoidable to deal with it, then doing that in a way that acknowledges a healthy perspective on sexuality that's not based on shame, I think means that you got to change the concept of worthiness when you're doing this.
Well, I don't know if we'll get into this now or later, but the concept of worthiness is inherently damaging and theological nonsense.
I think we're going to have a better point to enter that conversation, but it's kind of simmering under the surface of a lot of this.
Yeah, but it's crazy making to tell an adolescent person that their sexual thoughts are in themselves problematic. It's like, okay, you as a child, you are problematic then because you are human. Your humanity is the problem.
Yeah. Now, Dr. Hanks, you mentioned that your husband is a bishop, and so you may be closer to understanding how the church is instructing bishops to treat the issue of the law of chastity when they're dealing with the youth. When I was growing up, it was very much a central part of it. It caused a great deal of personal anxiety and thoughts of worthlessness for me growing up. But that's where I first learned about masturbation, was in my bishop interview when he said this long word that I didn't understand and he had to explain it. What is your take on the church's approach to this issue, understanding that they are continuing to ask about chastity? Mm-hmm. What's the state of affairs right now?
They're encouraged to ask general questions, but that they're just encouraged. There's no script. There's no like, don't go beyond here. There's no boundaries, and minimal training.
Right.
Okay. Minimal training in child development, in sexual development, in abuse. And a lot of people that I've seen in my practice were acting out sexually as teenagers because they were acting out abuse, trying to process abuse that was happening. And so a lot of bishops are treating kids who are being sexual as that's the problem, when the problem is unresolved abuse, and they're not trained to know that.
All right. When I think about how, positive steps that the church can change, one of the things that you'll see in recommendations about best practices is really looking at the culture that is built up with the congregation based on the lessons, the nature of the lessons that you have. And that's where we don't just assume that everybody understands what proper boundaries are. We don't just say, well, we're going to trust the bishop to know how far they have to go in asking questions. You teach the youth what the boundaries are ahead of time, and you tell them not just the things that are proper to ask, but you tell them things that are improper to ask, so that there's this ambiguity is removed. And when somebody crosses that threshold, then it triggers, and they're more able to articulate why something was inappropriate. And I think that would be a really great and healthy move. And it would, I think, also help address some of these things where we're allowing some bishops maybe to say things that are not healthy or helpful in the religious context of worthiness. All right, let's keep going.
A lot to that kid. The kid will have a better outcome if he knows the highest level of leader in his faith community actually cares about the thoughts of a teenage kid.
Gross.
The cynical view here is, of course, that...
Did I hear an exclamation?
I just said gross. Go on.
It is weird. I sense a deep reverence for the concept of religious authority external to oneself in her approach to this. Mm-hmm. And I can understand why that's appealing to some people. And certainly it's part and parcel of the way the church structure is.
There's an idealization of the hierarchy throughout the talk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that mentality, people have described it as clergyism. Or it's this thing in a religious relationship where there's implicit trust with people in positions of authority. And it's something that you have to realize and recognize that is going to cause you to make excuses for behavior, to assume good intent, and to ignore red flags. And that's why pre-stated policies that are informed by these best practices are so important, because they help us kind of navigate those biases that we all have in a religious construct. Okay.
That a middle-aged man would only care about teenage struggles in this if it were for his own gratification. But cynical is easy, and it misses some deeper undertows. So a common battle cry that you will hear in discussions from people who are against these bishop interviews is that they really act as grooming. And grooming is a process through which an adult readies a teenager to receive sexual abuse. But intent is required. Grooming is not any conversation about sex. It has to have an underlying intent to move toward abuse. Just asking a teenager about sexuality is not grooming. If it were, every time a parent or a therapist or a medical doctor has a conversation with a teenager about sex, it would be grooming, and clearly it is not.
Okay, this I think is an important point. What do you have to say, Dr. Hanks?
So it's appropriate for medical doctors who are trained to ask about sexual health. It is appropriate for parents who are responsible for their children to ask about sexual health. Those comparisons aren't a good comparison with a bishop. A bishop is could be a total stranger to this kid if they're a new bishop. They have no training and they have no responsibility other than that they feel feel responsible.
What of this description of grooming? How does grooming play a role in patients that you've seen that may be survivors? What do you think of her characterization of that?
I think her characterization is accurate, that there is intent, there needs to be intent, but that doesn't mean it's not abusive, or that it's not problematic, or that it's not harmful. So you can be harmful without intending to be harmful. And I've seen that a lot in my practice, where people are struggling with shame, because of sexual issues or, pornography viewing or whatever it is. The shame about that that has been perpetuated by bishops' interviews is problematic. And the bishop I'm sure they didn't mean to shame the kid, but it's still a problem. So I agree with her about grooming, but I also think she's missing the point that it can still be harmful.
Right. Yeah, she brings up this sort of notion that that cynically we have to say that the only reason a bishop asks these questions is because he's seeking his own gratification. Otherwise, it's completely benign. And I think that actually the truth, are there bishops who do it for their own gratification? Of course there are, because this happens. But it's it isn't that they may not be intending to do harm, but because the system and the culture and the teachings and the context have been set up in the way that they perpetuate the harm without meaning to. And I think that's really important to know. It's not a choice between a cynical predator and like a great pastoral care provider. It's a context and a system that perpetuates harm and produces harm without intent. And actually, that's a bigger problem.
Yeah. I think on the question of grooming itself, I've heard a prosecuting attorney or an attorney that deals with sexual abuse and sexual predators, and he's tried to make the point, which is sort of an agreement with hers, and that is when people are criticizing this issue and they say any questioning or any mention of sexual themes between a religious leader and a child is grooming. That's not true, because you do have to have this intent. And the problem is that ahead of time, you cannot tell the difference between grooming and simply people trying to help out. There's this really fascinating documentary on Netflix, which is the story of, I think, Jan Groberg, where her family had I think it was like abducted in plain sight or something like that, where there was this guy that just started helping the family out, and he was helping them with remodeling their home, taking them out to places, things that were not sexual. But what it did is it set up a normalization of blurred boundaries of appropriate behavior between an adult, a non-parental adult, and the child. And by normalizing that, it facilitated his eventual abuse. And not just because it normalized it for the victim or the survivor, but because it normalized it for the family. And one of the problems with not having some clear definitions about both appropriate and inappropriate interactions between leaders and children is that we leave room for normalization of inappropriate interactions that the kids and even the congregation may not be able to put their finger on why it rubs them the wrong way. And so they feel disempowered to talk out about it because he's the bishop, we trust him. Right. And that's where this is really dangerous for me.
Yeah, another point, John, is that offenders will put themselves in positions where they have access to children and youth, and they're really good at it, and they come off as really nice guys a lot of the time. And so that's why we see so many, Boy Scouts. There's been such a problem there. People who have access to kids, there's that opportunity to abuse.
Yeah, and they do it in a way it's really hard to discern between somebody who really does have a passion for scouting and for kids and somebody who's using that facade knowing that it gives them access to children. Mm-hmm. And you could say, well, that can't happen in Mormonism because you can't say, hey, I want to be the bishop. But the thing is, it has happened where people know how to perform religiously and put themselves in positions that climb the ladder of authority and access to children. And that's only when you're talking about premeditation. There are also examples of abuse and predatory behavior that happen when somebody with no history of it suddenly finds themselves in a position with a vulnerable youth that they have their own sexual thoughts and opportunity, and they act on it, even though they have no record or history of it. And again, that is one of those things where these boundaries should be protective so that situations like that do not occur. And so the step towards having another adult in the room is great, but it's not something that should be left up to the child. And because there's a lot of social pressure and a lot of misunderstanding about those things. Now, she's going to raise some interesting and compelling points about disclosure of abuse, and we'll discuss those when we get to it. Any other comments on this particular topic? All right, let's move forward.
Furrow goes on to say the best outcomes for teenagers also happen when two other things are present. One, they are held to high expectations as long as those expectations are reasonable. And two, they're supported in telling the truth even when it's difficult. It doesn't have to be consequence-free, but the teen has to feel like they're loved and known and dealt with without shame. These things are true in families, of course, and the best version of this happens in families. We would never say that that does not matter, but it matters in their faith context too. And in their teen years, it's increasingly so. Second reason why I think these interviews are helpful.
Okay, before she gets to the second reason, she mentions this, she just alluded to it, and she mentions it a few times as a positive thing, and she says that Mormonism, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is a high expectation religion. And that struck me as an odd thing, an odd term, because it's very similar to the concept of a high demand religion. And if you've heard of a high demand religion, that is a technical term that people who research what commonly is called cults will use, because cult is a term that causes a great deal of problem. But high demand religions define themselves by the level of, I guess, invasion into personal autonomy that the church expects of the individual, so that how they think, what they wear, where they go, who they, what media sources are safe, all these different things become very rigid and structured and controlled. And on top of that, there's a performative element of you have to go to meetings, you have to read things, you have to do things. And all of these things together describe the character of a particular organization as high demand. And I'm not sure what distinction, is there a distinction between high demand and high expectation? What do you all think?
Yeah, demand is there's no choice. Expectation is like, here's the bar, we'd like you to, I think there is a difference between those two terms.
Okay.
Because in parenting, authoritative parenting, it's high demand, high warmth, and responsiveness. Yeah. So that's where I know the term from, is from the parenting literature.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it may be a healthier way to conceptualize a religion that does have, and certainly Mormons would acknowledge, we do have high standards for behavior, for thought, for social interaction. Mm-hmm. All right.
Is their peers are getting this kind of support. One of the things you will hear people say, especially online discussions about this, Latter-day Saints are the only church where teenagers are expected to sit and talk about sexuality, and that's just complete nonsense. I'll explain why that's true in a minute.
All right. Katie, you come to us from a non-LDS perspective, and this was one of the, I think, most dramatic and compelling parts of your presentation in the 2018 Protect LDS thing. And I remember clearly you saying, if anyone in any other religious contexts saw what these interviews actually constituted of, they would be appalled.
Yep. And so they are, right? Like my colleagues in ministry, if it ever comes up, and when it ever comes up, and I explain this to them, they are absolutely gobsmacked. They've never heard of anything like it. They're just absolutely stunned by it and horrified. So this notion, and I don't know whether she was responding directly to that remark or if it's something else that's been floating around there. But this notion that lots of other churches just kind of willy-nilly bring kids into rooms and ask them, if they touch themselves, is not true. It's simply not true. And if there is conversation about sexuality, it's because the kid has initiated a conversation. It's very appropriate. You would never press for details about, to determine the sentence that would fit the crime, right? You would never be like, well, I'm not even going to.
No. Well, I mean, there's this famous video of a bishop interviewing a young woman who's about to get married, and she confesses some degree of sexual sin, and she doesn't want to talk about it. And he says, I need to know the facts because I need that in order to determine the repentance.
Exactly.
And that's the motivation for, the questions that are appalling that people report were given to them by bishops.
Right.
Another comment about this is, even if other churches did, that doesn't make it right. I mean, that's like kids saying, well, my friends are all doing it, so it must be okay. It's just an irrelevant point.
Yeah. Also that.
Particularly because all churches everywhere are dealing with the reality of sexual abuse as it's become more understood and more recognized, and we see that the scope of the problem is beyond what we could have imagined. So they're having to reevaluate things that all churches used to do without batting an eye and say, wait a second, that is something that facilitated abuse. We need to rethink it. And so I agree with you. It's not a good rationale
to do this. No, not all religions. You know what I mean? Like, this isn't one of those things that all churches did. They did not.
And I've never heard of a church scheduling another church scheduling it. Like, confession's not scheduled. It's when you feel prompted to go, is my understanding, right? Correct. So it's prompted by the individual's conscience, and it can be anonymous, and it's not scheduled.
Right.
All right. Well, she talks about two different paradigms. Let's see where she goes with this.
The situation is sort of complicated because the non-Latter-day Saint church is not a monolithic thing. You could break it down a million ways, but I'll break it down Catholic and Protestant. In the Catholic Church, teenagers are absolutely expected to sit in private and have conversations about sexuality. They call this confession. It happens on a far more regular basis than it does for Latter-day Saint teens. It's essentially analogous to what's happening.
All right. You're shaking your head, Katie.
It's not analogous. Right?
No.
Having a standing personal inquisition is not the same as having a voluntary, penitent, initiated conversation around what the person seeking pastoral care, advice, or confession is seeking. Right? Those are night and day, and to analogize them is pretty disingenuous, if I could be so bold as to say that.
Well, and to make that point, I want to show a video from a newscast that happened around the time this was in the press. And this is in the years immediately following the events of the Spotlight movie, where the Catholic Church was really having to come to grips with areas where they were having problems. And so let's take a look at this broadcast.
The incident happened at St. Robert Bellarmine Catholic Church and involves Reverend Nicholas Meshach. He's 26 years old. Tonight, the Archdiocese says his actions are a result of inexperience and go against the church's teachings.
On Monday, during confession, Father Nicholas Meshach allegedly asked several middle schoolers inappropriate questions about sexual conduct and whether they watched pornography.
The children did go home and say to the parents, I went to confession today. This was a question that was asked of me, and they felt uncomfortable.
St. Robert Bellarmine Catholic Church sent a letter home with students detailing what happened and explaining Father Meshach had been removed from the parish.
It's not encouraged that a priest would just take a whole line of questioning, whether it's a child or an adult.
Deacon McNeil with the Omaha Archdiocese says Meshach received a good report from the seminary and has no prior complaints.
A young priest who's trying, we think, to be too helpful, got a little overzealous with his line of questioning.
McNeil says he's glad the issue was brought to their attention and says all students go through safe environment training.
Children are taught and trained that if you feel uncomfortable with any type of an encounter with an adult, we train them how to react and respond to that.
Right now, McNeil says they're reviewing Father Meshach's training, but again, he is still a practicing priest. It also isn't clear how many students he talked to that day.
Okay, so we'll stop it there. But there are a couple of important things from that discussion. Number one, when you actually look at the timeline, when the kids got home and reported this, it was called into the leaders. He was relieved of his post the same day. It was very, very rapid. And the point that the representative from the Archdiocese made, which is that the youth are trained in what is proper boundaries and what is not proper boundaries. So when it happened, they knew to go to a trusted adult, their parents, and talk about it. And, much like for a period of time after Jack in the Box had a very bad outcome with their food safety, they ranked really, really high on inspections for food safety because that had been a problem and they had to kind of be very zealous in guarding it for the public. If this is the level of safety that Catholic Archdiocese is doing, that's respectable. That's understanding that they have a problem and working to fix it. But it contradicts the paradigm that she just articulated about that. Okay, so let's go back to our interview. Okay, let's continue here.
Those conversations are happening in private. Anyone who tells you we're the only people who do this, they don't know what they're talking about. Protestant teens have a bit of a hybrid situation. On the one hand, they're not generally allowed access to the top leadership in their church, especially the girls. So they miss out on this element that Furrow is talking about, where they get benefit knowing that the top leaders care about what's going on with them. In Protestant churches, there's no expectation that their top leadership, their pastors, have any concern about their day-to-day struggles. Some quotes from a group of Protestant teenage girls. One girl says, "The pastor of my church would have no idea who I am. He might know my parents, but he wouldn't know me if I ran into him in public." Another says, "Well, I guess I would talk to him," meaning the pastor, "but doesn't he have better things to do than to talk to a high school sophomore?" So Protestant teens aren't getting the benefit of getting the conversations at the top level, but they...
Yeah, what strikes me, Dr. Hanks, when you talked before about the idealization of leaders, it's almost like young teens looking at a rock star, and it actually increases their vulnerability to abuse by having this idealistic view of them. Do you see that dimension here?
I agree. I definitely do. I definitely do. And she's also conflating them being concerned at the highest level about their issues with having one-on-one behind closed doors interviews about and about sex. So knowing that your bishop or pastor is concerned about issues that are concerning you does not require behind closed door interviews about sex.
No. Okay. Yeah, I see. And that's kind of that straw man that we mentioned before, where, it's good to be clear about the types of changes that the church could implement in the direction of child protection that it's not mutually exclusive with continuing to have a conversation about chastity. It's just reformulating it so it's done in a way that acknowledges healthy practices. Okay, so let's...
One more thing, though, also, just to stick up for the Protestants. I don't know what Protestants she's talking about, but maybe we can all agree that large patriarchal male-only led megachurches aren't the best kind of, wholesome places. And so maybe you should seek out a small, say, female-led church. And I bet that pastor will know you, and it would be expected that pastor would know you and care about you.
That's a relevant point. All right. So let's see here. Here we go.
Absolutely are having these conversations with the sort of junior level of leadership that is over them, and it often happens without parental knowledge or permission. One non-scientific survey of Protestant leaders, the general consensus, over 80%, was that to refuse to talk about issues of chastity or sexuality with kids is to abandon them. and to advocate the responsibility over these kids that are in their care. And most of them, 60%, said they were entirely comfortable having these conversations with one provision, and that provision is that the kid is allowed some privacy and that there are enough safeguards in place that the adult is not going to be accused of doing something, meaning there's an open door, there's something like that. So,
all right. I don't know that this particular citation helps her argument because it's acknowledging, a real issue with there being visibility. It's taking a little bit the wrong perspective in terms of there's always been this fear that's frequently used as a reason to not believe people who disclose abuse, and that is that the fear of the false accusation. And it's my understanding that the research on this shows that those instances of false accusation are very, very rare. But that's not to say that when an accusation is made, there's no confirmatory investigation. And so I'm a little troubled by hearing that as the justification for it. But again, we've got this thing where when they talk about discussing sexual themes in a broad religious Christian context, that's very different from one-on-one private behind door interviews about sex in the paradigm of worthiness. The positive thing from this, I think, is that she's defending the right to continue to have leaders engage the youth on issues of sex. And I think that is good as long as we broaden that conversation to include the things that are healthy and protective. So discussions of consent, discussions of personal worthiness despite any sexual abuse or things like that, and some of the boundaries and things that we talked about, and understanding of safe pathways for reporting abuse. If that's started in primary at an age-appropriate level for who you can go to talk to about things, then maybe some of the statistics she talks about in the next section around disclosure would be, better. All right, so let's keep going.
Absolutely. So every church is struggling through this. We are not the only church who's dealing with this issue by a long shot. When the anti-bishop interview folks say that, they really just have no idea what they're talking about. Reason number 3, it allows for appropriate differentiation from their parents. The normal task of adulthood is that you have to go from being completely dependent, the normal task of adolescence is you have to go from being completely dependent on your parents to eventually becoming this fully independent adult in your own right. And there's a careful dance throughout adolescence of closeness and independence, and this is why parents and teenagers fight, right? But the adolescent must differentiate from their parents, and the religious adolescent must learn to grow from their childhood faith that is based in great part on their parents' faith to one where they have their own direct relationship with their religion or church. And youth interviews, though not intentionally, this is one way in which that happens. In childhood, up to around age 9, the goal is really for parents to have a strong attachment to their kids, right? Everything we know about developmental psychology says kids are not going to progress through that time of their life without a strong attachment, and that changes around age 12, where what kids really need is a secure detachment, not an abandonment, not by any means, but a time when a child can learn to act on their own while still having their parent as a safety net. The holding on is easier than the letting go. I'm the mother of a 19-year-old, I can attest to that. But if you want your teens to grow up into being healthy individuals, you have to let go.
All right, so she gave a perspective on the concept of individuation or detachment.
Differentiation.
Yeah. What do you think of that?
I think what she's saying is right on in terms of, yes, developmentally, kids start separating from their parents and form relationships with other peers, become important, and other adults. But that doesn't mean that can only happen with a relationship with your clergy behind closed doors talking about sex. It's not it's not related.
Right. They're not mutually exclusive, that you can not have one without the other.
Right. You can have relationships with your parents' friends or your extended family, or this has nothing to do with a bishop or having a relationship with a bishop specifically.
Katie, she describes the process of adolescence as going from dependence on your parents to independence. Mm-hmm. But I think in the Mormon Land interview, she expands on this a little bit more. And she explains that in the church, there is this expectation as an adult that you are going to continue to have regular interviews with a religious leader. And to me, it almost seems like transferring the mindset of dependence from your parents to the church itself.
Yeah.
And I think that's a perspective that it would be common in ex-Mormon circles, because when we look back on our life as a conventional Mormon, that's really how we felt we were supposed to interact. This was a dependence, both, I guess, mentally and in our conscience. You know, the way that we formulated what was right and wrong in the world was by deferring to church authority. And so there's this displacement of autonomy in those things to the church authorities. But I don't see that as a healthy mode of development. How do you conceive of that?
One of the things that characterizes totalizing ideologies and totalizing groups, right? Mm-hmm. Which I think could make an argument that Mormonism is, depending on the context, could be.
There's some elements of that.
Yeah, is that Alexandra Stein has written a bit about this. She talks about how she talks about totalizing groups from an attachment perspective, and that actually what happens is that the totalizing group subsumes other appropriate attachments, and that this is actually quite a dangerous thing. I can speak from my own experience, having gone through some pretty negative bishop's interview experiences, and I remember before I went into my interview, the one that I talk about in the piece that I wrote in the Salt Lake Tribune, I've talked about it elsewhere. Before I went into that interview, my mom actually did tell me, now if they ask this, you don't have to tell them blah 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 blah. But I did not believe her when I was in the room, and so I disclosed information that I felt very uncomfortable disclosing. Because I thought I had to, right? Mm-hmm. And so in this situation, it was actually my healthy attachment to my mom, who had told me a good thing, had taught me a good boundary, was subsumed by the high expectation of the high demand totalizing group, such that it took over the appropriate attachment place that my parents had. And I think that this is a real danger, and it causes a lot of trauma and harm.
Is there a different way to conceptualize that growth from dependence as a child on your parents to independence as a mature adult Mormon church member, Dr. Hanks, in a way that doesn't have those risks?
Yes. So in differentiation of self, in family systems theory, you differentiate from your family by being a unique individual, not by replacing your parental figure with another adult. So you claim your personal authority, your personal voice, and you become a unique individual who's in these relationships with other people. But you're not supposed to transfer that dependency onto another individual. You're supposed to own that yourself. And another thing that strikes me as missing is, what about an attachment to God and to Jesus Christ? Yeah. I mean, I would want them to attach to deity more than to their church leader. Preach.
Yeah, and that's that paradigm of developing a personal relationship with Christ as the basic foundation of your faith, that somebody who's in the role of a pastor would help guide you towards, but not try to assume that position.
That's right.
And that's where it was. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that's where, the notion or a culture of, let's say, voluntary confession or voluntarily seeking out pastoral care and advice. That's really where that comes in, where the pastor is there to guide you, to help you. And you know, if someone comes to me and they're struggling with shame about something, and they want to talk about something or whatever, the question, the role is not to judge, right? To act as a judge over them and determine, oh, you know, how many weeks do we have to go without taking communion, and, you know, every single detail to make sure that you're thoroughly and totally ashamed and, you know, humiliated. But instead, it's about helping them understand the gracious reality that already exists, that they are already forgiven, they are already loved, right? That there's nothing they could do or not do to change that, and to help them experience that for themselves in their own lives, so that they can grow into a more trusting relationship with God.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dr. Hanks.
I was just going to say, which ideally is what bishops should be doing,
right?
Is be fostering that spiritual relationship with God and Jesus Christ. And
it's difficult to see the broader Christian view of these issues of how you conceive your own personal worthiness and deal with your own frailties. But then in the policy change that the church adopted at the time Sam Young was doing this, one of the points they made in their documents was that it's essential that these interviews continue to take place, because the bishop is acting in the role of the Savior in these interviews. And having an understanding of the broader Christian view of grace and how that interacts with these things, I could understand how they would hear this, and it would not fall very lightly or kindly on their ears, because it is a totally different concept of the role of the Savior, what could turn into a form of gatekeeping towards grace that the bishops are standing in, that then has all of those issues of personal worthiness and failing to meet up to standards, that when you're a 14-year-old child, 12-year-old child, you know, bathing in testosterone, if you're, you know, a young adult trying to deal with these things, it's like this, you know, swirling spiral of guilt and self-recrimination.
Yeah.
All right, so let's keep going here.
What does it mean for a teenager in our church to grow into being a fully adult member? Well, adult members in our church who would like the full benefits of being involved are expected to give account to their bishop on certain behavioral markers, including issues of chastity, on a regular basis. This is a high expectation religion. And teenagers should be allowed to experiment with that reality as soon as it's appropriate, meaning as soon as there's something to talk about. Because if they are to stay in this church, that will be their reality, high expectations. So
Yeah.
So two adults having a conversation is entirely different than an adult and a child. I just want to, and she kind of seemed like, well, because they're going to have to do it when they're grown-ups, they should be practicing now. I don't follow that. That logic doesn't make sense.
Okay, so that's not considering the power imbalance that exists, which is a vulnerability for abuse. That is the reason for safeguards.
Right, and kids, and especially ones who have grown up idealizing the bishop or another church leader, they're not going to feel empowered to stand up and walk out of an interview. They're going to be scared to death. Where an adult who's had more life experience would be like, you know what, I'm uncomfortable. I'm out.
Yeah, and it's even a challenge.
Back.
Yeah, it's a challenge for adults as well. So if you consider that, then just imagine being a 14-year-old and having that. That's why I like the story of Nancy Rigdon so much, is because she's an example of a youth who was confronted with what she considered to be an inappropriate proposition, and she did stand up, and she's a great model for that. The one thing that I did appreciate about this part of the talk was that, to some extent, she's sort of saying that the youth should be given a chance for informed consent about what life is going to be like as an adult member of the church. So it's like you are going to have these interviews regularly. Now, if it was up to me, I would extend that informed consent to say that the youth should also know exactly what is going to happen in the temple before they ever go. So they're given a chance to consent to that engagement rather than the quasi-consent that happens at the beginning, which says if there's anyone who doesn't want to live up to these commitments, stand up now. But that's before the commitments has been explained to them. But that is a different issue. So we will move on.
The interview with the bishop gives them a chance to experience this and play with it while still having the safety net of their parents. Fourth reason why I think the interviews are good, disclosure of abuse. So most sexual abuse victims do not disclose their abuse in childhood or in their adolescence. The average age of disclosure is 52. That's first disclosure. That statistics comes from the organization called Child USA, the national think tank on child protection. So bishops are probably not going to have a kid walk into their office, plop down and say, here's what's going on with me. When adolescents do disclose, 75% of the time, it's accidental. They didn't actually mean to do it. But what happens is they say something that doesn't quite add up to the adult that they're speaking with. So while bishops are not directly asking about abuse, asking about chastity is close enough that some kids are going to accidentally disclose. But when bishops are so afraid of asking them,
can we decouple the notion that sexual abuse has anything to do with chastity?
Please.
So if there is a concern that a child is being abused, then the questions should revolve around, are you being harmed?
Yeah. To give her credit, she's articulating what I think was one of the most effective rebuttals to the movement about Protect LDS, and that is that, Sam Young and other people would say there's no role for the bishop to have any conversation about sexual things with children. And then other people would say, well, what about the instances where a child is being abused by a family member, by a neighbor, and they see the bishop as the only safe place? If we, as a matter of policy, say that bishops are not allowed to talk about sexual themes, then we close off that avenue of disclosure to them. Now, and I think that's why this is her last pillar. It's the one that makes the biggest impact. What do you say to that?
So, yes, but she's also saying it's highly unlikely that they're not going to disclose abuse. Right. So if you feel something weird, bishops ask about it, but they're not trained to probe about abuse. And so I talked with my husband about this. I said, have you had any training in how to handle, if you sense there's possible abuse, have you been trained in how to ask what to say next? He's like, no, we've never.
Yes, he has. He's been given the phone number. You just beep, 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 beep.
But so she kind of is making, going against her point. They're not going to say much. And I can't imagine the bishop being the safe place. They would go to a teacher, they would go to a friend's parent, they would go to a friend.
Right.
They could be one of the many people, but they're not going to come in most likely and disclose abuse. So I think this is one of the weakest arguments that she makes.
Yeah, and the statistics backs that up when she mentions that it's usually decades for abuse. It's longer for males than it is for females to disclose the abuse. And this is far beyond when they're a teenager. But that being said, are there things that could be inserted into the culture and education of children that could improve those statistics? Well, maybe if they're educated early on about a channel that they could go for reporting. But to your point about the training, I think even in school, if a teacher sees something in the form of a drawing or overhears a comment that sparks their mind and says maybe there's abuse, well, the teacher doesn't sit down with the student. The teacher contacts somebody in the school who has been trained in that and is tied into CPS and the the people who have training and accountability for responsibly investigating these things, and they already have the processes in place for then bringing in law enforcement when that's necessary, making sure that the actual process of asking about abuse is itself not traumatic, because there are wrong ways to approach that.
Right.
And I've had multiple clients where they have been raped but didn't realize it was rape, and the bishop treated it as sexual sin, and because they were ignorant about what is a sexual assault and what's not. And if I've had clients tell me that their bishop said, well, if you enjoyed it, then it wasn't rape. And it's like, so if you had a sexual response, it's not rape. That's ignorant and not true. So bishops are not prepared to be the first line of abuse reporting.
Right. And I think there is a reality, and that is that some bishop somewhere is going to be the first person to pick up on this. And so the question comes is does the church have at least instructions for the bishop for what to do? And my understanding is yes. If they have that suspicion, what they're supposed to do is to call a hotline. That historically it went to the church's legal department, but now it goes to therapists who interface with the legal department. And so is that, a lot of people have criticized the existence of that hotline itself. They've said that the church, if a bishop suspects this, they should contact their local CPS, who has a branch for investigating allegations of abuse. And that way there's not this mixed allegiance or agency about representing the interests of the church in the event that a local leader is involved in that abuse. It can be purely done for what they call victim-centered approach, or something focused on the interests of the abused. And I feel like by not even, in some instances, I feel like this presentation is a little bit of it's sort of a crisis of imagination. It's not conceiving that you could imagine a paradigm where you can hold on to the things that may be good and healthy about how the church operates, but then adapt best practices in the interest of child safety around it. All right, so let's keep going here.
The next question, or asking any probing questions, because they don't want to be seen as abusers, it's very hard for that kid to disclose. I know we feel weird about it, right? About bishops, middle-aged men alone in a room with teenagers asking a probing question about something a kid just said on such a sensitive area. I get it. But the asking of the questions themselves is not abuse.
Okay, let's talk about that itself, because she says the asking of the questions, what she's referring to is the questions about chastity, and that itself is not abuse. And so we're going to kind of separate the conversation about disclosure, because this is a different issue. And what do you make of that statement, Dr.
It
Hanks?
depends on what they're asking and why they're asking it. It definitely could be abusive, or it could not be abusive. It depends on the situation. So to say it's definitely not, you can't say that, because you're not in every situation.
Yeah, and I had a conversation with someone about this issue, and the question I posed was, are there any limits to what should be considered acceptable for a bishop to ask a child? And the answer was no, that you cannot place any limits on them, because that then impairs his ability as a judge in Israel, as the mantle that he carries on his shoulder. If he's limited in any way to where he can go, then it impairs his ability to be the bishop. And I think that's one of the big issues here, is that the church is very hesitant to draw boundaries about what is inappropriate. They're more than welcome to say it's appropriate for them to talk about these things, and we can even have some agreement that discussion of certain subjects is appropriate, but I think without those boundaries of what's not appropriate, we're missing out on some of the certainty about some of the ambiguity that exists now. All right, so let's continue.
In the rare situation when a teenager does decide to disclose on purpose, it's almost always done in a very tentative way. They'll put a little piece of information out there and they'll wait to see what your reaction is. Usually, that piece of information is something small enough that they could take it back if they needed to. This was my experience, actually. I made a decision that I wanted to disclose about my sexual abuse. I had read the book Macbeth in school, and Macbeth it's about a lot of things, but one of them is about the danger of keeping secrets and how it destroys you from the inside out. And I was incredibly moved by that, and I decided I wanted to disclose. But even me, who was in this kind of unusual situation of deciding to do it, I did it in the most teenage way possible. And that is, I identified a leader in my church at the time, a man who was working with the youth, and I gave him one little piece of information to see what he did with it, and it was a test. And he picked up that little piece of information and asked some follow-up questions. And it did not happen all at once. It actually, I think it took about 5 or 6 hour-long conversations before I had breadcrumbed enough information that the only conclusion he could come to was that I had been sexually abused. So my word.
All right.
So in my view, it is totally inappropriate for an adult man to be having 5 hours or 6 hours of conversation with a young woman about sexuality. Did we lose John?
Bye, John.
Come back.
Well, yeah, like at a certain point, there needed to be some
action.
Off but the other thing that strikes me about her story is that what she describes is she decides she wants to disclose, and so she identifies someone that she trusts and goes to that person and discloses a small amount of information that she feels safe disclosing. And so she was actually very much an agent in that experience. And her, pastoral care provider, the pastor in that situation, it doesn't sound like pushed her, or do you know what I'm saying? I agree with you that at a certain point, 5 hours alone with a kid, like you, as a pastor, you probably should be thinking really hard about what you're doing. But even setting that aside, she's demonstrating and making an argument for a practice or a system that does not exist. She's defining a practice that should exist, where the kid or the youth initiates the conversation with a person they identify as trustworthy.
Well, if we think about what she's arguing in the context of Mormonism as it exists, if we have a youth who has a desire to make a disclosure, I think a youth now could say, "Hey, Bishop, I would value having a chance to talk to you." Okay, Billy, let's meet after the third hour block. Oh, there's no third hour block anymore. The second hour block.
There's no block anymore.
No. Sign into Zoom. But and so I think that can exist as it is now. So in our call to say that we've got to create boundaries and have standards that are in the interest of protecting children, can that still exist? Because if we simply say no adult can meet one-on-one with a child, that, regardless of what you talk about, that is the standard. If you go and look at recommendations for institutions, including religions, is that there should be no private one-on-one unobserved meetings. So regardless of whether you're talking about sex or not. So if that is the case, how would a Mormon youth who has an intention to disclose do that? well, the question comes then, are you able to disclose with two people in the room? Because if we say as long as you have two people in the room, you can. And I think she makes the argument that there would be fewer people who would be willing to disclose that. And granted, we're already talking about a small percentage of people that disclose as teenagers in the first place. But I want to make sure that we're acknowledging the reality of her argument, because I think it is something that people will argue with. The question are those few instances a sufficient justification to leave broad vulnerability to all the other people who may themselves be subject to both the intentional and the unintentional forms of psychosexual abuse that happen? All right, let's keep going.
Word of advice to bishops is that if a kid gives you a piece of information that makes you suspicious or that doesn't quite make sense, follow up on it. Ask the next question. You will run the risk of asking too far. You will run the risk of that kid or his parents being angry at you for asking questions. They might hate you for it. You will run the risk of someone thinking that you're only asking questions for your own titillation. You might be incredibly misunderstood, and blamed, and I am sorry for that reality. It is the risk you took when you became a leader.
Okay, so all of these risks that she's just talked about are real, but there are also risks that the church, since she knows about them, the leaders of the church know about them, and you can account for them in formulating policy. I think it's very possible for them to, if the church had guidelines for, even if it just took the form of, okay, Bishop Hanks, we're going to train you on what are some of the hallmarks of abuse, what are some red flags. When you see a red flag, that's when you get CPS involved. You are not responsible for going down that pathway, because a lot of CPS investigations turn up nothing. But that's their job is not simply to confirm abuse that a bishop, pounded questions into the head of a child until they blurted it out. They are the ones who are responsible for asking responsible questions in a way that also provides documentation, so that if it's not fully disclosed now, in the future we can say there's a pattern in a way that's accountable.
There's also a problem and therapists have to deal with this in how you ask the question.
Yeah.
Did he do this? Did she do this? Did he touch you? Putting ideas into a kid's mind that actually didn't happen. And so there's a lot of influence you have by the questions that you ask someone who's disclosing abuse. And so therapists struggle with that. And, bishops, very few of them are therapists. They're accountants and CPA, doctors and lawyers. And so there's a protocol for asking questions when you suspect abuse. And professionals know what that is, and lay clergy generally do not.
Right. So you avoid all of those risks that she just had if you implement a policy that has triggers for diverting the inquiry to a responsible and accountable and trained party, specifically not affiliated with the church, so that there's not diverging interests that are playing a role in that investigation. All right, let's keep going.
And as a former teenager who was in the midst of abuse, I implore you, if a kid gives you some information in the chastity part of the interview that doesn't make sense or that seems like a breadcrumb, follow up, ask the next question. One note here, what often comes up in the conversation with people who are against these interviews is they will say, well, bishops aren't therapists. How will they even know what to do with that information? And it's true, bishops are not therapists. I'm a therapist. I know exactly what therapists can do, and they don't do what bishops do. our roles are very different. Let your bishop off the hook for not being a therapist and let him be a bishop. So, back to
that comment doesn't make that comment doesn't make sense. She's saying they should be therapists by doing the follow-up questions. I don't think most people think their bishop is a therapist.
Yeah.
I mean,
and she's expecting them to be able to navigate sensitive issues like that with the responsibility of a therapist, and yet they're not therapists. So there's a bit of a disconnect in the way that this is being presented. She mentions in I think the Salt Lake Tribune article or a different interview about this subject, she expands on this a little bit more, and she talks about how bishops, let your bishop be a bishop, let your therapist be a therapist. Bishops deal with repentance and worthiness, and therapists deal with health, mental health. And I think this is kind of the appropriate time to talk a little bit about that concept of worthiness and how it plays into the dynamics when we have these things here. Particularly, there's the person who preceded or followed Katie at the Protect LDS Children March was Dr. Mark Mallon, who's published research on ecclesiastical sexual childhood abuse. And in his presentation, he drew a distinction between two forms of abuse. He called overt abuse, the type of sexual abuse that we commonly think about, where you have a predator who grooms and finds an opportunity and commits abuse. And that's one form of abuse. Statistically, it is rather rare when you compare it with what he called covert psychosexual abuse. And that is where you teach as divinely ordained truth hurtful and harmful ideas that then become internalized into the psyche of a young, impressionable youth, and then starts to disrupt their development and mental health, and feeding into cycles of depression, anxiety,
OCD.
Yeah, exactly. All of those things. So do you have an understanding, or is that something that people talk about on this issue in your practice, Dr. Hanks? Is this kind of subtle? He said it's more prevalent, but it's harder to pin down.
Yeah, it's really hard to pin down. And I've been practicing for almost 30 years now. So I've heard every level of, from covert to unintentional abuse. I just feel as a professional, I need to bring up the point that she's a therapist, but she has very limited experience as a therapist. She's not licensed to practice independently yet, which means she barely graduated within the past 2 years. So it's interesting, that she's speaking as kind of an expert when she's barely joined the church and is a brand new therapist. So I just want to, and not to disparage her, I'm sure she's obviously a lovely person, but I just think there's some not ethical, I don't know. She's just not experienced in these areas yet.
Okay. Yeah, one of the concerns I had just seeing it, even from when they posted it ahead of time, was that FAIRMormon would exploit her credentials both as a therapist and as a survivor of abuse to give greater weight to a perspective that is perhaps not informed by some of the best work that's been done on this issue in the broad academic sense. And I think that bears itself out when you closely examine some of these things. But the things that she's talking about are commonly discussed perspectives. And so I think it's good that she's giving this presentation, because then it gives us an opportunity to expand on why some of these perspectives don't carry the weight that perhaps they are thought to. All right, let's keep going.
To our uplift data. The next most significant question that comes up is, the question is not, did something inappropriate ever happen in a bishop's interview? Because the answer is yes. We already know that. You can read all the stories. The question becomes, how often are abusive things happening in interviews? And that turns out to be an extraordinarily complex question to gather data on. It's very hard to nail this down. In our data, it's very clear that there is a large percentage of people who believe that asking the chastity question word for word as it is written is in and of itself sexual abuse. I do not believe that it is.
All right, Dr. Hanks, you were shaking your head on that one. What do you think?
I don't know that there's a lot of people. I've never heard someone say, if you ask it just as designed, that's sexual abuse. I've never heard, I mean, even people who are against the interviews, I've never heard them say that that's abuse, asking that question.
All right, so I looked up the church around this time. In good faith, I think they released to the parents, these are the questions that your bishop will be asking, and we're asking them, except in rare cases, not to deviate from these questions. And the question that pertains to chastity is, quote, do you live the law of chastity, unquote. And so the question then is, and Katie, I'm interested in your perspective, is asking that question, saying those words, abusive in any way, or is she creating a straw man?
I think it's highly ill-advised.
Okay, and what informs that?
In the context, again, we're talking about this in a context where a person is going in out of a social, cultural expectation and social, cultural, religious expectation that they would go into this interview with someone that they may or may not trust, that they may or may not want to have this conversation with, and they are initiating a conversation by asking that question. So that's bad pastoral practice. And I might argue that worthiness interviews as a construct are deeply harmful and you might argue abusive, right? Is asking that question in and of itself, sexual abuse? Like, I don't think legally we would say that, but it's highly ill-advised. And I actually think her argument here, where she's about to downplay or minimize that say, well, these people who say that they had an inappropriate experience with someone just asking them, do you live the law of chastity? Like, they don't count. Their experiences don't count. They're wrong about the way they perceived that experience. Whereas instead, I would ask her to flip that around and say, golly, why do so many people feel as if having been asked this question was inappropriate? Yeah. Why are so many people who are still believing and active, right? If this is the sample we're dealing with, why do so many people who are still believing and active still say there was something about this that was off, right? Yeah. And the fact that she just dismisses it out of hand, to me, speaks more about her lack of experience in the culture. As an outsider, recent convert living in Seattle, God bless her, I'm sure her wood is awesome.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Than being a 12-year-old girl growing up in rural Utah, being taken into a room by, God's representative and ask that question. It's really different. And I would hope that as a therapist and as a former minister, that she would pause and hear that, and hear the pain and the anxiety and the shame and the sorrow in those answers, and in the high percentage. She actually never tells us what it is. I'd be fascinated to know. But
it was like 90%. It was really high.
Yeah, she says it's really high, but she wouldn't say what it was. And the high proportion of answers of people who said, no, actually, that was inappropriate. Maybe that's really important information in this conversation.
On top of that, I think you can't look at this as simply, oh, he said those 5 words in a closed door interview. That's not abuse. Those 5 words are a cap on a whole body of instruction and education about what the law of chastity means. It's learning from the Book of Mormon that it's a sin next unto murder. It's learning that, from old conference talks that you better come home in a coffin rather than come home unworthy. It's, all of these different harmful teachings around the issue of chastity that youth have been saturated in, that then is brought to the razor's edge in front of the bishop in a closed door behind, where nobody else can see, and where you are now faced with your own personal guilt and shame in the face of God's representative.
And you've been summoned. You didn't go there.
Yes.
You were summoned to the Inquisition.
Right. Yeah, and you know that your friends who expect you to be able to go to the temple and do baptisms for the dead are going to understand the grand total of what happened in that interview by whether or not you go, or whether or not you take the sacrament, or whether or not you pass the sacrament.
Yep.
And so there's a whole bunch of stuff. So I think in one sense it's a mischaracterization to say that the critics are saying, well, that's sexual abuse by just asking those questions. But in a broader sense, you have to acknowledge the weight of that question, the imbalance of power that exists in that interaction, and the thing that she admitted at the outset, which is that culture and theology have direct effects on mental health, on how you exist and interact in a religious paradigm.
Yep.
All right, let's keep going.
When we look at the data, and people seem to be saying that, we have to consider one of two possibilities. One is in their own bishop interviews, or maybe with their children, they were so still in their innocence that even asking, do you obey the law of chastity, was a scandalizing question to them. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that they have a belief that talking to teenagers at all about chastity should be off limits, no matter what the lived experience of that teenager is.
Stop.
One
Can you
person
stop
said,
it?
Yeah.
Or the third option,
Right.
is that they experienced it as inappropriate.
Yeah.
They hated it. It felt bad.
Yeah, and on top of that, she's now talking about data from the Uplift interview where people self-report whether or not inappropriate things were asked. And I think a big part of that is when you exist in a paradigm like the grown adult that I talked with who said there should be no boundaries on what a bishop asks, you've never been taught healthy boundaries. You don't even understand what that is, so you may not even be able to conceptualize the idea that a bishop could ask anything inappropriate, or you think that it's so far beyond the pale that you would excuse things that other people would see as clearly violations of boundaries. All right.
says we should provide privacy on this issue and don't believe it is something the church should be speaking into. The critique of that is, of course, something like, even if teenagers are struggling through issues related to sexuality, we should abandon them and leave them to struggle alone. The church doesn't care.
All right. Is that a fair characterization?
It's not. She's thinking and presenting this as so black and white. Either we have closed door bishops' interviews about sexuality with all kids, or we totally abandon them in their time of need. Like there's so much in between there that can be helpful and healthy. But when you frame it as this or that, that's just an unfair, like, oh, then fine, abandon them. That's not what,
right.
That's not what we're saying.
Yeah. I think even, we have three different perspectives here in terms of the church. And I think the fact that each of us can articulate a way where there is a role for healthy interactions with non-parental adults that may include instructions about healthy boundaries and healthy sexuality, and done so using religious language and a religious framework, and yet there's still a role for taking proactive measures to establish boundaries, to establish expectations, and to improve the child safety environment of the church. That it's clearly not the black and white situation that's being presented here. And one of the failures of opportunity here is that by focusing on this one question of the straw man, of this, all or nothing view, we've lost an opportunity for them to identify tangible things that maybe even fall short of this interview question that the church could do. Simple things like background checks on any leader that is going to be interacting with adults. It's a simple thing. It's not going to pick up every single abuser, but it is one of those minimum thresholds that most other institutions, religious and non-religious, that deal with children do. And so there's opportunities to even talk about what the church can do, even if they're not going to agree about these things, but we never get to there. All right.
And clearly that is not the message that we want to send. So in our data, when we just asked the question, has anything inappropriate ever happened to you in a bishop's interview, the number is actually extraordinarily high, way beyond what you would expect. So we had to control for the people who they were asked the chastity question word for word, and they found that offensive. So once you take that group out, you get a number. And I'm going to tell you what that number is and run the risk that you will misunderstand and that this number will get repeated as something that it is not. It comes with a lot of caveats. So the number of people who say they were asked something inappropriate in a bishop's interview and they did not mean the chastity question word for word, in our data, 3%. That number has a lot of questions attached to it. What we don't know about that 3% is, were those just awkwardly worded questions that the bishop was kind of probing? He had no intent on being grooming, he had no intent on abusing. He's just trying to figure out kind of what the lay of the land is. Or was it a bishop just trying to find out the extent of what a teen is even talking about because the teen is apprehensive to spell it all out for him? So he has to find the contours of the edge and goes too far. It also could have been a bishop who was looking for an accidental abuse disclosure and asked the question that the kid is offended by because abuse is not happening. So when I say 3%, that is a starting point. There's no way in this data to analyze it in any way that gets some of those answers removed out. Further research would be needed to figure out what that number is.
So, what do you think about that?
So she's minimizing people's experience of that question. Like, if that many people think that that's intrusive and inappropriate and uncomfortable, that's a problem. And she's like, well, that's not a problem. Let's just look at this 3%. And it's like, well, what about that other group? We have a problem here. If most people say, yeah, that was really uncomfortable, I didn't like that, it was inappropriate.
Particularly when you look at the population that is tested, most, like a big majority of these are people in the faithful paradigm. And they're the ones who, she said, I mean, she didn't give the number, but it was a high number.
Plus 3%'s a lot, yo. There's like 15 million people in the church, and I mean, come on.
So 4% of Catholic priests molested children in the later half of the 1900s. 4%.
Wow.
So I figured out if 4% of bishops, and that's actual abuse, not discomfort, uncomfortable. So that would be 1,221.44 bishops that are abusing kids. And they're probably abusing multiple kids.
Yeah.
So we're talking about thousands of people. It's not the potential. Right. And that's not even counting the people that where they didn't report the abuse. So if we're anything like the Catholic Church, we're talking about thousands.
Yeah. All right. Let's keep going. I think we're getting near the end of her presentation. If we have time, we may be able to take some calls from our viewers. Let's take a look.
And I want to be extraordinarily clear. This number does not mean 3% of interviews are abusive. It does not mean 3% of bishops are abusers. It does not mean 3% of Latter-day Saint kids have been abused in bishop interviews. It means there's 3% of interviews that probably should be looked at to say, what actually was happening here. They say that good research just provides more questions, and there you go. So in the survey data, some potential changes were offered. Again, I don't offer these as here's what we should do. I will give you my thoughts, but just as a snapshot of here's what people are thinking. Number one, there should be very strict guidelines for what bishops are allowed to say. One commenter suggests the law of chastity should have a set definition the bishop reads from. He should not be allowed to say anything else, any follow-up, and he's excommunicated. It's pretty harsh. But it's also followed up by another commenter who observes, it's really difficult to be a bishop and offer any advice that's helpful without knowing the details, and sometimes you have to ask questions. Fair enough, right?
What do you think of that perspective from the pastoral care viewpoint of what she just said? I think that's a common thing.
I mean, you have to ask questions, but the questions you should be asking are not, and where exactly did his hands go, and how exactly did that feel? And instead should be more along the lines of, how are you feeling about your relationship with God in this moment? How are you feeling about yourself? What, if anything, do you feel you need to do to make it right? And I'm not assuming that in a consensual, youthful, sexual encounter that anything needs to be done to make it right, but I'm just saying, like, in general, you know what I mean? How can I reassure you of God's grace and love and forgiveness in this moment? Do you know how beloved you are? Do you know that you are forgiven? You know what I'm saying? Like, those are the kind of questions that we would ask in a pastoral situation, not trying to pry for details about how far it went. Doesn't matter.
That's a very different way of approaching this issue, I think, because in the Mormon context, there is a need for repentance now. And so it just completely changes how you approach the issue. All right, let's keep going here.
The church has been offering advice on this topic for ages. This is a pamphlet from 1981 where the church offers 2 paragraphs. The pamphlet's called Counseling and Interviewing Guide for Bishop. They offer 2 relevant paragraphs here. I'm not going to read them. The first one basically says, sometimes you're gonna have to be specific because your interviewee might want to be vague. The other one essentially says, and you need to be age appropriate about what you're asking. The uplift data actually touches on this a little bit when asked if respondents believe that it's appropriate to ask more specific questions to 17-year-old young men preparing for their mission. Almost everyone says yes, of course. More detailed questions for them than maybe a 12-year-old.
I love this slide because it shows an example. It says, one of the great sins of our generation is sexual promiscuity. There is no subject with which the bishop should be more concerned in counseling and interviewing ward members. As in other areas of counseling, the bishop must be specific. He cannot assume that the person being interviewed knows what he's talking about. He must spell it out. It's not sufficient to ask, are you virtuous? It's not enough to say, are you clean? Again, we're injecting language of worth based on these questions. The bishop must put the question more directly. Have you ever had sexual intercourse with a person of the opposite sex? And that's the paradigm now that bishops are getting. And then it follows it up with, you want to scale it down or up based on the age of the patient. But I think that speaks to the difference in the approach on these issues. How would questions like that, peppered with notions of cleanliness and virtue, affect the mind of a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old, Dr. Hanks?
Shame, sexual shame, and embarrassment. A lot of kids don't even know, what are you even talking about? I've heard several clients say they learned about sexual things from their bishop. They didn't know what masturbation was. Like, do you masturbate? Well, I don't know. Or do you touch yourself? Well, yeah, I've touched my, what is that? That's not the role of a bishop. And we are way too obsessed with sex. Anyway, why is this such a focus it's, in the church we say, oh, the world is so obsessed with sex. We're obsessed with sex, and it's a problem. We need to not focus so much on it. There's my soapbox. I'll be
all right. Okay, let's keep going. Let's get this slide off.
So other suggestions that are offered, that there should be a second adult present. This is a common one, but like everything else on this topic, it's pretty complicated. For people who believe the chastity question is in and of itself inappropriate, that does not solve their problem. One respondent says, how could it be better to have two adults asking my daughter inappropriate things? It's still abuse, it's just being done by two people now. So it doesn't really solve that problem.
Okay, I have to interject here because this was one of the things that it struck me, because in the middle of all the Sam Young stuff, this change came out, and the church ultimately excommunicated Sam Young for what he did, but they did adopt one of the recommendations, one of the things he called for, which is that you could have more than one person in the interview. But as she points out, many critics of this say, well, how is it better for there to be two people in the interview if you're still talking about abusive things? And to try to make this point, I created an animation about what this might look like. And so I want to play this here and get your comments on it.
Well, thank you, Susie, for showing up for your annual interview. As you know, the church has recently come out with new guidelines which allow me to ask you if you would like to have somebody join us for the worthiness interview. Something about, not trusting me, making me look like a predator. You don't think I'm a predator, do you? No, of course not. All right. So do you want another person in here for the interview?
Yes, please. Very much so.
All right. Let me call in my second counselor. All right, Nick, why don't you come on over here? Let's get started. Nick. He's the second counselor. Nick,
Hey.
what's your name?
How's it going?
Little Susie, yeah.
Hey,
Susie.
I'm Nick. Yeah, I'm Susie.
All right, Susie, in preparation for the assessment of your worthiness for the upcoming temple trip,
Yeah.
there are a few questions we need to ask. Now, there are two of us here, so you know that these questions are on the up and up. Now, first of all, we may as well get the most uncomfortable part out of the way first. Now, I need to ask you, Susie, do you follow the law of chastity?
Oh, yeah,
What?
yeah.
You don't know what that is? Well,
Hmm.
the brethren have defined the law of chastity as covering a myriad of sexual sins,
Oh, yeah.
some of which may include masturbation.
Oh,
Now,
yeah.
Susie,
Why do
do
I have
you
to
know
talk-
what masturbation is?
I don't want to talk about this with you.
No,
That's all right, Susie.
that's gross.
It's okay. He's the bishop. He's the father of the ward. He's not going to do any. He's not going to ask you anything bad or anything like that. He just needs to know these details so we can make sure that you're an upstanding, moral girl. I see you got some skin showing on those shoulders there, so the boys are probably paying you some attention. We just need to know these things, for your own good. So go ahead and answer the question.
Thank you, Nick. Now, Susie, when's the last time you touched yourself?
Oh, jeez.
No, that is totally outrageous. You guys are a bunch of creepy old men.
You
are asking questions like this of a small child. No, it's nothing bad.
It's for repentance.
Be cool.
Absolutely not.
I have the priesthood.
Yeah.
What do you guys get off on that kind of information?
No.
I'm going to call your mother in
Right
here.
ahead.
Oh.
Please do.
We're going to bring Sister Smith right in here. Sister Smith,
want her
in here.
All right, Sister Smith, come in
Sister
here.
Smith, come on.
Sister
Well,
Smith.
what's all the kerfuffle about? He was asking me crazy questions. He's the bishop. He asked me if I masturbate.
These
ask you
are the
anything
questions.
inappropriate. Asked me if I masturbate. Do you? That's none of his business. The law of chastity.
Yes.
He's the bishop. He's supposed to find out if you're worthy or you're not.
Thank you.
Siding with him? Well, of course, I sustain him.
Yes.
So I have to agree with anything that he asks you. But he's a
Very
creep. It's
well
what I
said.
do to be a righteous Mormon. It's what you need to do.
Thank you, Sister Smith. It's very clear that you understand the proper way of things. As a matter of fact, there's nothing in the manual that doesn't allow us to have 3 people in the interview. Why don't you come right around here to this side of the table, and we will proceed.
Make some room, Nick.
yeah,
Nick,
yeah,
Nick,
yeah.
yes, yes. Sister
Yeah.
Smith, come here.
Okay,
All
yeah.
right.
I feel like I have the priesthood.
Now let's get started.
Let's get it on.
Oh dear. Remember, he's the bishop of the world. He represents the Savior.
I am.
No holds barred. Answer the questions.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you masturbate? Do you touch yourself over your panties or under your panties?
These are all questions that people said were asked of them
Sex
by
with your
bishops.
boyfriend?
Answer.
You can be honest. He's the bishop.
Does he touch you?
I bet he does.
Have you had vaginal penetration?
It's for forgiveness.
Have you engaged in oral sex?
Be
It's
honest.
for repentance.
Where did he touch you?
You can tell him.
Did you orgasm?
Yeah.
Go ahead and tell him.
Did your boyfriend climax?
Oh.
It's for your own good.
What were you wearing?
It's part of repentance.
Have you ever had lesbian sex?
He's the bishop. He deserves to know.
Did you enjoy it?
So the last part there that is very uncomfortable is taken from accounts of people who were all asked those questions in the context of a bishop's interview. And I think the point that I hoped that that video made is that just allowing another person into the room when the basic structure of the entire interaction is inherently unhealthy and the power dynamics are inherently disproportionate, and the information and the context of what defines sexual sin and how it plays a role in your spiritual life, it almost compounds it and makes it worse, because now she has her parent reinforcing the messaging of the bishop. And again, we're not talking about the overt sexual abuse. We're now talking about those covert, unintentional psychosexual harms that happen when hurtful things are taught authoritatively, if that makes any sense.
Yep.
All right. So if we go back to our presentation.
But still, 64% of people say it might be a good idea, and the current church handbook absolutely allows for this. But in our research, almost everyone agrees that having a parent there makes it a little bit more difficult for teenagers. 75% say a kid's going to be less likely to open up. One commenter says, no one wants their mom next to them if the bishop is going to ask you about sex. Another respondent put it this way: the more people you put in that room, the more I'm going to smile and feel the pressure to say the right things, even if they're not true. Just a note, the current handbook also says anyone, not just teenagers, anyone may have a second adult with them in an interview at any time.
So I think an interesting phenomenon that happened around that thing is before the church changed that policy, we saw people saying and making the case that there shouldn't be two people because it would impair the role of the bishop. And when the church then enacted the policy, it was very rapidly accepted by the church membership as a good thing and lauded as a good thing. And I think, we see this again and again in important church issues, is that one of the few benefits of a church polity that is very hierarchical is that you can implement radical change in a positive direction and get broad acceptance of it very rapidly. And so there's an opportunity here for the church to really adopt some good policies, and it will do so without the institutional pushback that may happen if it was a more dispersed polity where you had to convince individual congregations to do it. That's my only comment there. Anything else on that as you see it? All right, let's keep going.
Another change that is offered is bishops should just ask, are you obeying the law of chastity? If the kid says, what's the law of chastity? Bishops should end the interview, call in the parents or phone up the parents and say, you need to explain to your kid what this means. This is a parent job, not a bishop job, and they end the interview there.
What do you think? That she's making, these are not her suggestions, these are suggestions from the survey.
How about we just don't do these interviews?
Well, you just placed yourself in one camp. But again, to be fair, you're not saying that there's no role for teaching children concepts and principles and issues of matter of health around sexuality. It's just that the interview is not the vehicle for that.
Right.
Okay.
I admit that I see some wisdom in this, but the hole in it is pointed out by one commenter who says, the problem is when the youth doesn't understand what chastity is and you end the interview and call in the parents, tell them they need to instruct their youth on this subject, you've actually created more problems. Now the youth feels embarrassed because they're being forced to have a conversation with their parents about sex.
What about the embarrassment of being forced to have a conversation with the bishop about sex?
Exactly. This whole section is like so funny because it's like, exactly, this is why this entire structure is pretty crappy and why people feel like even being asked that question is inappropriate.
All right.
And worse, this youth now has to explain to all his buddies why he can't advance because the bishop wouldn't let him. Now the other youth ask why, and it opens up embarrassment even further than just having a simple conversation of pulling out the For the Strength of Youth book, read a few sections, re-ask the question, done, and move on.
Why would the bishop not allow them to go to the temple if they didn't even know what it meant? That doesn't make sense to me.
Well, the temple trip is on Saturday. Right, the temple trip is on Saturday. He's going to have time to get taught the law of chastity by his parents.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then he's got to come back for another interview. We're not going to have time to do that. We can't just do it on the way to the temple.
Okay.
But, I mean, she does speak to social stigma and how that plays a role in the way that worthiness is conveyed to the youth.
Exactly.
And that compounds the issues of anxiety and depression that go along, because when you look at the inputs of that, it deals with acceptance among your peers. I mean, all those things play into the mindset of youth struggling with these issues.
Which is why it's not just like a regular pastoral care visit.
Yeah.
That dynamic that she explains, I wish she would have just a tiny bit more imagination to be like, oh, that's why people hate these and they don't help at all.
Yeah. Okay, so let's keep going here.
My word of recommendation would be parents. If your child is preparing for their first bishop interview, please have a conversation with them about what the law of chastity entails. In conclusion, I have some recommendations for both parents and bishops. Parents, the responsibility of raising these young people is squarely on your shoulders. The church has empowered you the freedom to sit in on those interviews if you want to. They have specifically invited you to do so, but please consider your teenager might need a few moments to say some things to their bishop that they're not ready to say to you yet, and they might need a chance to develop their own relationship with their high expectation church. Bishops. Jesus tells a story about the shepherd who leaves 99 sheep and goes out and looks for the one. And in our context today, the one, in my thinking, is the young person who might disclose abuse. If you are able to maybe be brave, maybe hear what they have to say. But what Jesus doesn't talk about in that story is that the 99 might get real mad about it. And it puts you in an impossible situation. And there's a lot of voices that will tell you that asking teenagers hard questions is equal to abuse, and it's not. You might actually be saving their life. As someone who was the one lost sheep, I beg of you, listen to the Spirit, and when a kid says something that doesn't add up, have the courage to follow up the question. Or if they give you a tiny breadcrumb of information, be willing to receive it in a way where they will be willing to tell you the next piece. Bishops, I do not envy you your job, but it might make a world of difference in the life of one lost or scared sheep. I thank you for your time and attention, and I would be delighted to answer questions.
All right. Any comments on her final statements there?
To me, you know, the main takeaway that I get from this, you know, from her whole presentation, the thought that just coming back to me, that just kept coming back to me over and over again, is what she's describing is what she wants for LDS kids is to have good pastoral care, right? So she's invented something that doesn't exist, which is an area where there's mutuality, where someone, you know, where the kids feel like they want to disclose. Do you know what I'm saying? Like she's invented an imagination of LDS children and youth, and I would say adults receiving good, solid, loving pastoral care. But that's not what worthiness interviews are.
Yeah, and I think that's probably informed by her experience. She talks about her own experience in finding a leader she could confide in the way that she did. And I think it's very easy to see the value that played in her life and want that for any other abuse victim.
Right.
But as you say, it's not a mutually exclusive thing with one-on-one interviews about sexuality, the way that the church has done it in the past.
Right. That's not what that is, right? And I want good pastoral care for LDS kids too. My kids are LDS. My husband is LDS. I want them to be safe and cared for and respected and honored in their pastoral relationships. I want them to know that that no one has the power to sit in judgment of them or tell them if they're worthy or not. I want them to know deep in their bones that they are loved and cherished by God, and they are forgiven, and they're always forgiven, and there's nothing they could do or not do to lose the love and mercy and forgiveness of God, right? Like I want them to know that, and conditionality introduced into the pastoral relationship through constructs of worthiness and of qualifying for God's blessing rob people of that inherent knowing of their own belovedness. And so no matter what you do, if you're going to call people in and do an inquisition based on a checklist, I don't care how nice you are when you do it. I don't care how benign you are in the wording of the questions. The construct itself does not lend to the outcome that you want because it's premised upon a false and faulty theological worldview. And it's a huge problem. And so if the LDS church wants to fix that, that's where they have to start.
Well, Dr. Hanks, she's talking about a complete not reboot, but reconceptualization of chastity and worthiness from the way the church has taught it for, since its inception. Does the church have a way forward on this? And are there other examples where it's reformulated moral issues in such a way?
And I think there are some bishops who are doing that. It's not like all bishops are, just this checklist or saying, conditional worth. So I want to give some credit to the bishops who are doing a really good job and demonstrating the love of Jesus Christ and the free gift of the atonement and all that good stuff. So, and I think we need to do a lot better with teaching grace, with focusing less on sexuality. Like, why is that the thing we're asking about? Why aren't we asking about honesty? Why aren't we asking about how we treat other people? There are so many other aspects of life that matter, and you could say matter more than what your sexual behavior is. So I think there's a lot of room to grow and a lot of room to be in a healthier place.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate both of you taking the time to comment on this. I want to be respectful of your time, and so we do have the opportunity to open up phones and see if anyone is willing to ask questions on the air. Do you have maybe 15 minutes for that? All right. So if you've been watching and you would like to engage and ask questions or give us your thoughts, you can call 210-422-2222 and ask questions of Dr. Julie Hanks, Katie Langston, give us your perspective on everything that was discussed here. It's fascinating to see this issue in the limelight once again. It kind of came out of nowhere when FAIRMormon posted their advertisements for the conference, and when I saw this talk was on the queue, that was when I made the decision to go ahead and pay for and watch the conference. And it was certainly thought-provoking, and then to see it followed up with a Salt Lake Tribune article contrasting her perspective with that of Sam Young. They interviewed both of them for the article. Then it reminded me of the importance of this discussion. And Katie, you were just today published in the Salt Lake Tribune with an article responding to that. Tell us a little bit about what inspired you on that, and let me see if I can put it up on the screen so people can see it. Again, if you would like to join the conversation, the number is 210-422-2222. Oh, hold on. It looks like we have a call. Let me just get everything set up. All right, hold on. Caller, add to stream. Hello, you are on Talk on Things and Stuff. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi. Good afternoon, John. Jim Pagisa here.
Oh, hey, it's nice to hear a regular voice. Yeah, I think we can hear you. Can everyone hear the caller?
Uh-huh.
All right, what's on your mind?
Okay, super. Yes, well, one, I'm glad you're back, and ladies, you've done so wonderful. I've really enjoyed it, Dr. Hanks and Katie. Yeah, this is really good. I'd like to just kind of weigh in, and this is kind of a hot topic for me personally. I've worked with a lot of youth over the years. I'm out. I've been out over a year and a half, but I was in for almost 40 years of my adult life. And so I've seen a lot of stuff happen, and I was never a bishop, fortunately, which I wouldn't want to be, but I was a counselor in a couple different bishoprics. So I know this is happening. So, well, my question for everybody is, I got a question for everybody, if you don't mind, and just a quick question for Dr. Hanks.
Yeah.
But anyway, so this is happening during COVID lockdown. I've seen some of the emails the church has sent, just generic stuff, but they're talking about, doing sacrament at home with worthy priesthood holders. So I guarantee you, bishops are calling these young men, because they did it before lockdown. And I don't mean bad men, I mean good men that are having, good intentions and everything, and they're trying to be a bishop to the best of their abilities and understanding. But they are actually, so picture you're a young man, you're going through lockdown, school's out, you got your phone, maybe you've been watching some stuff that might be questionable or whatever. You could very well have, I know it's happening now because I swear I've seen it personally happen before. Bishops calling and saying, hey, you're the man of the house, or your dad's not active or a member or whatever, so are you worthy? So they're being checked on. There's a far reach of the bishopric. It's not just in an office. Oftentimes I've seen bishops reach out. And now if somebody feels compelled, a young man or young woman comes in and feels compelled to confess to the bishop or whatever, yeah, that's kind of like a confession thing. But the bishops and stuff, they've got a checklist, like you were talking about earlier before the temple trips. Hey, we got to, get our checklist. Okay, let's go down the questions, law of chastity, blah, blah, blah. And depending on the bishop, they may or may not want to pursue it or whatever. But a lot of these poor young men especially, they could have a masturbation journal check-in buddy, and who wants that? I think personally that is in a way abusive as well. What do you think about that kind of thing? Because I promise it's happening right now to a lot of these poor, deacons and priests and lockdown and whatever. And
so you've talked about, proper boundaries for even communications between bishops and youth outside of the office. What do you think about that, Dr. Hanks?
Yeah, I think we have some work to do there. I think there should be boundaries, and if someone is distressed about sexual behavior, that go to a therapist who treats sexual acting out or sexual compulsivity, or Like, it's not necessarily a spiritual problem. You might need some emotional and mental health support. So I think that's an area where sometimes bishops kind of take on that role of therapist when they don't treat compulsive sexual behavior.
The thing that he's talking about, where bishops are checking in by social media, texting youth directly. I've seen other religious and non-religious institutions have clear guidelines in what constitutes appropriate communication between leaders and youth. And so if there was ever any text communication to a child, it always has to include the parent in the same line of communication so that there's no exclusive communication between a parent and a child. And that's a measure that they've realized there's a need for when they've seen cases where the grooming behavior or crossing inappropriate boundaries happens through social media, through text like that.
I believe there are some guidelines now about communication with minors. I'll have to check with my husband on that, but that I believe that that they're not supposed to directly be texting individual kids.
Okay, because I think one of the things that you'll see in guidelines proposed around this issue is not simply you put the guidelines in place and you're done, but it's rather a constant reevaluation of what the current state of research is on it, and so that we can evolve to adapt to things like social media, which are quickly and rapidly changing.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for your call. We're going to see if we can get another question on the line.
Okay, John,
Yep.
I had a quick question for Doctor. Is that okay? Remember,
Oh, yeah. Go right ahead. Yeah.
I really want to know, Dr. Hanks, I didn't know, like I said, I was in the church, lots of administrative callings over the year and everything, but I did not really know until the very, very end that if there was an abuse case, somebody was being abused and the bishop knew about it or whatever, you've got the hotline to call, which goes to the church legal department, and like John said earlier, now it does whatever, you get counselors, but still, they absolutely want to keep it hush-hush. And I've seen two cases in my life that were tragic. I had no idea at the time, but one, they went through the church and they just kept to cover it up for years and years and years, and then more and more abuse happened. And he served with callings, and those poor kids actually went to church with this man there present who were being abused because he was terrible, and it was horrible. And then another one, he was someone over a long period of time, but they went to the cops, and he got 30 years in jail. He's there today, as he should be. So my question is, and it's kind of on a personal level, and I'm not trying to, well, it's personal, but it's one of those what-if questions. I'm just curious how you process it. So here's the situation. Your husband's a bishop. You're currently going to church. You obviously know what's going on. You're qualified and all this type of thing, but if someone comes through, like, the bishop's office in your world, in your land, and you realize they've been being abused, and then your husband's going to be instructed to call the number and keep it hush-hush and whatever, follow whatever the church says, versus versus going through the law or whatever. How would you handle that being in your unique position? You're educated, you're qualified, you're a therapist, and all these things, but also you've got the church angle on it too. How would that get processed in your world? I'm just curious.
In my world? Yeah, we've talked about it, and I know the channels to go through, and we've talked about you call the hotline, but you also call the authorities, you call CPS. So he knows what he's supposed to do from a mental health and protecting the victim standpoint. But you bring up a really good point of why we need more, we need female leaders too, because a lot of the abusers they're more likely to be male, and they're more likely to be friends with the bishop. And the bishop's going to have an incentive to keep it hush-hush, just like it may be their best friend, it may be their golf buddy or their coworker. And so I just think that creates problems when we have kind of the all male leaders. There's an incentive to kind of cover for each other. And I think that's another problem that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. And it can be as simple in guidelines. When I was thick in the middle of the Protect LDS movement, I took some time and looked at guidelines for reporting abuse in this church, in the Community of Christ, and some other religious institutions. And there's just kind of a fundamental difference between Mormon church. The instruction is you call the church headquarters. They will instruct you what to do based on the regulations and requirements of the state. If it's not a mandatory reporting state, you are not going to be instructed to report it because you have ecclesiastical confidentiality protection. And so they won't mandate that you report it. Now, a bishop could do it prospectively on their own, but if you have someone who's a company man and only going to do what the company says, and they don't. Now, contrast that with Community of Christ. Community of Christ says, we do have a legal department. You call us in conjunction with independently calling legal authorities. And we will work alongside them, but we are not instructing you to contact us first and follow our guidance. We're saying contact us in conjunction with them. And that fundamental single change there changes the priorities and how decisions get made in the interest of protecting potential victims. Yep. All right, Gibby, thanks for the call. Great questions.
Thanks. Well done all. Appreciate it. Thanks.
All right, take care. He's a regular. He's usually more jovial, but we're not talking about as serious stuff like that. All right, we've got another call. Let's see what we got. Hello, you are on Talk on Things and Stuff. What's on your mind?
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Oh, okay. I'm just watching the.
Oh yeah, if you.
Interviews thing.
Yep. If you mute your computer, then talk just directly to the phone. You'll be able to stay on track. There's just a little bit of a delay.
Makes sense.
Okay, no problem. Oh. Okay. Sorry about that. Hold on. I'm not necessarily a question on my end. Like, I've no longer decided that I'm going to be Mormon or anything, just as a personal thing. I just really appreciate what you guys are doing, because I know that every time I had a bishop interview, they came to that question of, do you follow law or chastity? I'm like, I would forget every time, and then they would just try to tell me, and I'm like, wait, I mean, I tickle my sisters. Is that, like, inappropriate, you know? It's just definitely something needs to be done about it, because it just builds up this whole thing with shame and everything, you know, and I'm still recovering from it. So it definitely needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm sorry you had those experiences, but I am also glad that we have a forum to have these conversations, and that's where I think it's easy to see somebody who comes out with a perspective like the one we examined here and completely demonize it. But I think that we gain a lot from really taking it seriously and trying to respond in ways that can be positive and uplifting, and take experiences like yours and even some of the ones that maybe weren't, you know, validated in the presentation and take them seriously. So I appreciate you calling in.
Yeah, and God bless you. I'm sorry for your pain, and I wish for peace and healing for you.
Thank you. That means a lot.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anything else?
Just appreciate what you guys are doing, and I hope that we can figure out how to help other people like me so they don't have to go through the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thanks for your call.
Peace.
Mm-hmm.
Bye now.
Bye.
Okay. Well, while we wait for another call, there was a comment made here from Marnie Jakeman. Dr. Hanks, have you thought about putting forth a hand to help make these changes happen, or even discussions about it in the church? Okay, I think we may have you muted. Okay, I'm going to unmute.
Okay.
There,
Sorry.
we can hear you now.
Okay, great. I've done a lot of speaking up in the media. I've done a lot of podcasts, media interviews for Salt Lake Trib, different national outlets speaking up about this. And I post about it on social media frequently. That's where I feel like my influence is kind of helping the culture think differently about it. I haven't actually met with anyone like at church headquarters, but that I feel like using the media to influence is the way that I can make a change.
Yeah. I think that's been the approach of a lot of activism on this issue is we don't really have the power to force the brethren to change, but what we can do is educate the membership about this issue and the importance of it. And that there is, even though I know the brethren talk about facing the members and conveying knowledge that way, we know from things like surveys that there is a trickle-up effect of some of these things. Mm-hmm. And we've seen some fruit of that so far. Okay, we've got another call. Let's see here. All right. Hello, you are on Talk on Things and Stuff. If you mute your computer, we'll be able to hear you.
Is this really happening?
Who's this?
Can you hear me? This is FW.
Hi.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to talk to you. I've been watching your videos for like a month or so now, and like we're trying to get caught up on all of them. I just love you. I apologize I'm a little late to this episode. So
no worries.
Thank you to your guests, but I'm gonna have to go back and watch the rest. I just caught that you guys were on, and I've been listening for a little bit. So okay, can I just dive in?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, so I don't know if you've been following some of the more recent developments that have been going on over at FAIRMormon, but they have a new podcast now with this young woman, Hannah Syriac, and
yes,
she's had on John Gee, and she kind of seems to be developing like a new style of, I don't know, it's just she has some interesting approaches, I guess you could say. But the thing I wanted to point out and kind of run a thread through some of these items here is her last episode was on polygamy, and she specifically focused on Helen Mar Kimball, and she did something that was really interesting to me. She kind of took the Brian Hales approach, which to me is put a bunch of information out there so that you can kind of like speak from a position of authority, like I know all the dirty details.
Right.
But then instead of like being forced or dragged, like kicking and screaming into admitting that there was a likelihood of these relationships being sexual, she kind of seemed to like just charge right through the red light, which Brian Hales doesn't do. And she said that it's likely that Helen Mar Kimball was menstruating, and so therefore she had reached the age of maturity, and that there was really no issue with whether that relationship was sexual or not, because they were in fact married. And it just struck a chord with me in such a way that I have to put that like juxtaposition together of the normalization of that concept with the purity and the chastity that we champion in the modern church, and the way that we're expected to put ourselves in this place where we suspend all of our natural
our critical thoughts,
morality, and
yes,
where like when it comes to that position, it's like an Abraham and Isaac thing with polygamy, well, okay, it seems carnal, it seems antithetical to our entire modern Mormon identity, but if God was requiring it, it's one of those things where you would just have to dispose of your thinking and just allow this priesthood leader to do that thinking for you and tell you that that's okay.
Well, what I want to do,
you get this whole flip message.
Yeah, exactly. What I want to do is frame what you're talking about in a way that's relevant to this discussion, because I think you, like me and many others, probably look at our stories, our Mormon history stories, and as we've learned about the issues of ecclesiastical sexual abuse, we can't help but see echoes of it in the 19th century context in the way that we learn the story of polygamy and Joseph Smith. And so then when we place ourselves in the modern day and we are interacting with religious leaders in the modern framework, how do we make sense of the disparity between the apparent double standard that happens here? And I want to turn this question to Dr. Hanks because she's living this precarious position, I think, and is balancing that. What do you think, Dr. Hanks?
Can you be more specific on?
Sure.
On
So for me, I found it really disconcerting to have this talk immediately follow the story of Helen Mar Kimball, because when I study what we would consider to be religious sexual predators like Wayne Bent, Julius Shacknow, these are names of other people who have created independent religious frameworks, and they've used their position of authority and a doctrinal framework to justify unorthodox sexual practices with vulnerable people in their population. So they may say,
in and outside of Mormonism.
Yeah, and they may say, young child, God has taught me that we are to share love with everybody, and that includes sexual love, so it's okay. I, as the prophet, will now interact with you sexually, and that's an expression of God's love. And since you revere me, you can see that as just and right. And that erodes the normal sexual boundaries or the normal relational boundaries. And when I study those in non-Mormon contexts, I learn a set of rules about what constitutes religious abuse. Mm-hmm. And then when I study church history and I see those same dynamics take place in particularly Helen Mar Kimball, but also in Nancy Rigdon, then there's if I don't allow myself to say that because he's the prophet, then I find I'm falling in the same thing. So we know that there's people like Brian Hales that have found some way to reconcile these things and carve out. I see it as carving out an exception, and I know other people see it in different ways. I know this causes a lot of people mental anguish. So if they come to you as a therapist, how do you help people reconcile these things? Is there a way to do that?
I don't think there is. I mean, sexual being a sexual predator is being a sexual predator. And so I just work with what people's feelings and thoughts are about it and validate wherever they are. I don't have an agenda of keeping anybody in the church or having them leave the church or having them lose faith or,
Okay.
I just take them for where they are and work with kind of, and some things you just shouldn't reconcile, right? Like, it's like, that was not good. That was wrong.
Right.
And let's just call it that.
Yeah. And I think it's important to kind of keep in mind how deep sexual shame and sexual coercion is in the Mormon psyche and in the Mormon culture. And so, this goes to the very, center, the beginning of our founding, really. Yeah. That there were these elements in the culture, and I think that the almost kind of catastrophic overcorrection, right, from the initial sort of predatory behaviors of Smith and Young, and now an almost overcorrection to not be seen as sexual deviance, comes out, I think, in this sort of ultra focused level of control that happens through these interviews. That ironically, the way that unprocessed and undealt with shame and trauma happens is ironically actually perpetuates the cycle of a sexually toxic kind of culture. But I see these things as interconnected, kind of outgrowth of the kind of really ugly aspects of parts of the founding of Mormonism. Yeah. This shit is deep.
Now I have to go censor that. Thanks a lot, Katie.
Sorry.
All right. Well, I appreciate your call.
Can I
What's
just
that?
draw one more connection really quick? Can I draw one more connection?
If you can make it brief. Yeah.
Just super fast. It's super brief. Okay. So I think that the connection is that you're right. There's an overcorrection. Go from all one way to the other. But what the commonality is, you still have these male priesthood leaders handing the standard over to other people, and then they, as the individuals, are being forced to allow that priesthood leader to make that decision for them of what is good and what's bad, and we don't have that personal moral power, empowerment in the church to decide for ourselves. So we're always giving our morality and our conscience to these men. And then it was polygamy. Now it's slightly different, but I think it's still the same kind of like dynamic going on. And that's the common thread.
Yeah.
I agree.
Excellent point.
Sorry for taking up too much time.
No worries. All right, excellent points. All right, take care. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks so much.
Bye now. All right, you guys have hung in with us for just over 3 hours now, and I want to let you get back to your families. So thank you so much for being responsive. Both of you have just added so much depth and, thought to this conversation. I've been in conversation with Jennifer Roach on this issue, and I found her to be very thoughtful, and she's willing to examine other perspectives on this and to treat them seriously. And so it may be that she'll have a chance to look at what we've discussed here, and maybe she would want to come and have a discussion, and certainly I would welcome that. So anything as a final word, Dr. Hanks?
I just want to echo that I believe she is so well-intentioned and that her intentions are good. And so I just want to acknowledge that and honor her for that, and also honor the abuse that she suffered, that shouldn't have happened. That's horrible, but that's a really painful thing. And it's really brave of her to speak up, even though I disagree with some of what she says.
Yeah. Well, Katie, we'll give you the last word.
Oh, whoa. I think what Julie said is right, that, I think it's really easy to demonize and vilify people who have different perspectives than us. And in particular, something like this that does strike really close to home and kind of hits at the heart. So I do appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. And I think if there's anything that I could leave folks with, and, in my experience, this is something that a lot of Mormon folks just need to hear. It's that you're loved and you're okay. And if there's something that you've done or something that you haven't done that's weighing on you, right? I just want you to know that I believe from the depths of my soul that no matter what it is, there's nothing so terrible that could separate you from God. And that go in peace. You don't need someone to tell you. You don't need someone to tell you that you're forgiven and that you're worthy of love. But if you do, let it be me. And you are forgiven and you are worthy of love, and go with that.
All right, that is excellent. Well, I want to thank you both for being just outstanding representatives of both a mental health therapeutic perspective to healing and wholeness, as well as a pastoral care perspective to healing and wholeness. And I know that those two dimensions are very important in the lives of many people who find themselves both in and outside and around the church right now. So thank you so much for bringing your wisdom to this conversation. And with that, until next time, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff.